Okay, it's telling me that we're live. I'm going to assume that we're live. The chat will no doubt tell us. Welcome, one and all, ladies and gentlemen, everything in between, to episode 3 of State of Disunion, which, thanks to Tucker Carlson's ignominious defenestration, is now the Anglosphere's most watched show, wouldn't you know? I've got a very special guest this evening, an old friend, in fact, who you probably know already, but just in case you don't, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Oh, hello. Yeah.
Hello.
I
Threw you
I
in there,
am
didn't I?
I am the Little Platoon. I do film stuff, pop culture stuff. Weekly live stream on Mondays, frequently-ish on Open Bar with a Drinker, and all over the internet generally. And we kicked off like over a year ago. We both did a live stream together on the Little Platoon channel called The Weekly Show, which dealt with stuff beyond pop culture, higher brow matters of culture. And so to rekindle the love of things beyond Star Wars, here I am today.
Yeah, God, those were halcyon days, weren't they? I think we started in the COVID pandemic, the beginning of that.
Yeah, us and all 5 viewers. It was great fun.
Yeah, we were lucky to get 12 viewers in the early days. It was a celebration. Speaking of Drinker, I heard, or I thought I heard you uncorking something or unscrewing something in the back room before we came on. Is this the case?
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's not the best. It's just Johnny Walker Red because they've run out of black. But
Well,
yeah,
if it was good
red
enough
label
for
it is.
Churchill,
Churchill
Churchill was
drank red.
oh god, he was a big fan of Johnny Walker Red. He used to mix it with soda water, I think, pretty
Oh,
much all hours of the day.
oh, I feel slightly better about myself.
I'm on the wine, but it just says South African Red on the front, and that's the only the only information given. So it's not the best wine, but it will do the job.
I never trust that. The only hangover I've ever had, you probably know the story, came after, it was at uni when we were after incredibly cheap bottles, the cheapest bottles we could find. Because everyone was very poor, went to the supermarket off Kensington High Street and found a plastic bottle of red wine that was just called red, and drank 4 bottles of that, I think it was, each.
Oh
Only
dear.
hangover I've ever had. It was 50p cheaper, though, than one that was just called Rouge, which, of course, is French for red. So that's the culture premium you get. Call it French, and it's an extra 50p.
Was that the night you fell into a glass of water?
That's happened a few times, but no. That was when you came round to mine. We had a house party, and it was. I think that was whiskey rather than wine.
Oh, fair
Now I
enough.
just now I just knock things into glasses of water. I haven't fallen into one for a while, but my phone's fallen in about 4 times in the last month.
Blimey.
And my
Oh, it's,
e-cigarette, which is even worse. You know when your e-cigarette's
oh
fallen into a
God,
glass
yeah.
of water in the middle of the night because you go to take a sip and you suddenly realize it tastes like very, very strange. And then you're drinking liquid nicotine and then you don't sleep for the rest of the evening.
Yes, and it is quite possibly explosive. You've created an IED in the dead of night. It's good that we're talking together actually after so long not having done so and recounting anecdotes no less because Scooter Tart in the chat says I always thought you two were the same person, and he's not the first person, or she is not the first person to have said this. So it's good to put
No,
that
I've heard this
to
loads of
bed.
times. I commented on one of your videos a couple of months ago saying that you had said something about, I don't even remember what the video was. It was something to do with movies, and I said that you would never be able to persuade me to respect you for liking Godzilla, King of the Monsters. And then someone underneath that said you will never be able to persuade me that you're not the same person. Well, now here we are, so I win.
Now here we
Random
are.
commenter.
Well, the flaw, the great flaw in that theory was why would someone with 100,000 subscribers pose on off days as someone with a couple of thousand? I don't know.
Escape the limelight. I don't know. Well, I have a second channel, which is the smaller one, which is Lost Chord, which is
Yes.
now mostly the repository for the best show in universe episodes when they go up.
Oh, is that what that stands for?
It is, yeah. We spent ages coming up with names. Much like I think when because you came up with a Little Platoon for the name for my channel, which is nice. But
Yeah.
it took us ages to get around to doing that as well. And so I'm doing this show with the Movie Cynic, and it took us we had 3 or 4 weeks, basically a month of doing episodes without a name for the actual show. And so just as a placeholder, he'd done a thumbnail calling it the best show in the universe, and I said put probably underneath so we sound modest, which he did. And we brainstormed a number of different ideas, and chat came up with ideas which all varied around like a little cynical show or a cynical platoon show. It's like they were bad, but none of them really stuck. And so in the end, we decided that the best one we had was the one that we came up with by accident. So yes,
That's
that's
often
what
the
it stands
way.
for.
Yeah. Oh well, that it's a fairly inoffensive acronym. I was somewhat alarmed to realise that State of Disunion spells sod. Uh, so we can be two sods for the next hour and a half or hour, or whenever you have to
I'm
go.
always up for that. I think that's a very apt name for the channel. Sod
Yes,
Republic.
yes. Well, I mean, I work on boats now half the week, so sod, sodomy, rum, alcohol. I mean, it all coheres.
I work on boats now, so sodomy. Yep, yeah, that makes sense. You're not in the
Uh,
navy though.
no, I'm not in the Navy. I'm not yet an able seaman. Although I was once an able seaman, because I'm sat here. Would you be in the Navy if you joined the armed forces, or would you join some other?
Having lived on boats, yeah, I think if there's one I was
Yeah,
going to join, navy. I like the idea of that little sort of floating community, which is common, sort of defined by ties of brotherhood and brotherly love. I don't mind that idea too much. You get to sail the seas, you get to go to nice places. In the English Navy, you don't really do much fighting anymore, so you spend most of your time docked in very, very, very nice parts of the world. And yeah, I have experience on the water and with seamen, so it's the most fitting by far.
I was going to say, if you're in the Navy nowadays, you spend most of your time leering at the Chinese in the South China Sea, or helping illegal immigrants onto your own shores. I'm not really sure that you do much else nowadays.
Or arguing with the French who inexplicably staff your aircraft carriers. Yeah.
Yes, do they?
They did for a long time. I don't know if they still do, but when the two new-ish ones, or the one that's actually working at the moment, that was the thing. It had no fighter planes, and half the staff, I think, were French. It was some kind of cost-sharing enterprise.
God. See, the English always laugh at the French, but actually, I think at this point in, I can't believe I'm saying this, at this point in history, they are they've got a number on us, or a few numbers on us. I think they do many things better. I mean, having said that, I'm not sure which republic they're on yet, and I have heard talk recently that the Fifth Republic is due to fail.
So you
And
do know which one they're on.
oh yes, I do. Yeah, you just contradicted myself. Well, it's a stab, isn't it? It's a stab. The fifth, I think, and then Macron is, well, I don't know how much longer he'll last.
So I was having a chat about that with there's a guy with the YouTube channel called Echo Chamberlain, who's a really, really lovely guy, a New Zealander, and
I
writes
love
writes
that
on New
name,
Zealand
Echo
quite. It's a
Chamberlain.
brilliant name, isn't it? And yeah, really, really good guy as well. You should invite him on here one time. He'd be right up your alley.
Mm,
But
mm.
he's a New Zealander and writes on the subject of New Zealand, and I think he wrote recently talking about New Zealand's sort of hazy relationship with the monarchy. The fact that all of the last several, is it a Labour Prime Minister at the moment? Yeah, it is, isn't it? The person who took over from Ardern. They've all said that independence is a thing that they think they want. Republic is probably going to happen, but it's not a priority. And they've been saying this apparently for the better part of 2 decades, which does really give us the prospect that the French will go through 5 more republics before the New Zealanders get there first. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen.
Yeah, and the Australians as well. I mean, they've been going on about how they want to get rid of the monarchy for decades.
Yes, yeah, they have. Which is all. I'm all for that personally, but good for them. No, I like that tacit Republican spirit that they have, but also that sheer I don't give enough of a fuckery, which means they don't really get around to doing anything about it. Kind of, yeah. That's a good old legacy of the Anglosphere, I think,
I was
as
going to
opposed to
say
the
that's
French,
also rather
which
charming.
it is, yeah. As opposed to the French are much more totalitarian in their outlook. If they get some vague radical idea, they'll turn it into a government, and then they'll turn a different opposite idea into a government later on as well. But no, they are far less ashamed about their cultural past and their empire, though, which is why they still militaristically go around sodding various African countries in the name of La Francophonie. Whereas we kind of apologise for everything,
Yeah.
and we don't have a military with which to sod African countries at the moment. So yeah, up the French, I suppose.
Indeed, indeed. Well, the thumbnail to this video does picture Darth Vader being crowned King of England in the coronation chair at Westminster Abbey, for which I employed, I must admit, Dolly 2, however you pronounce it. I was interested to see what it came out with, and it came out, well, that was the best one it came out with. So whether or not we get on to Star Wars at all, given that tomorrow is May the 4th, be with you, I don't know, but given that we're talking about republics, it may be a good time to talk about the monarchy and republicans. Because in this country, I mean, I agree with you that there is a noble republican tradition wherever it is to be found. And in this country, I suppose our republican tradition can be said to have, well, to have founded America, obviously. So our republican tradition is most evident in America and what America is and was at the time. And that's all for the good because America is a wonderful country. Um, but I don't know. I feel like we gave them all our best people and we haven't got any in return. So when I look at Republicans now, right now in contemporary Britain, I can't say I think they're a particularly wholesome or intelligent bunch. I think that, well, they're just miserable. And their criticisms are so predictable as well. I'm not saying there are not legitimate criticisms to be made of the monarchy. There certainly are. And I say that as a monarchist, but they're a miserable bunch.
They
I,
are. I mean,
I don't know if you saw recently, actually, there was, I think it was Republic UK, by whom they're chiefly represented. But whether it was them or some sort of satellite organization, I don't know. This group of Republicans, and they're always sort of like middle-aged, boring, pasty anorak-wearing men. They were shouting, "Not my king, not my king, not my king," at a group of school children who were shouting back, "My king, my king, my king," or something. And someone commented, if you find yourself spending most of your week shouting at children, maybe your political cause is due a look in the mirror.
I just think there's something wrong with anyone who goes out into the streets shouting slogans about anything. Like, I have no
Yeah,
time for it. It doesn't matter what the
I
cause
totally agree
is.
with
I
you.
have no time for that sort of person. It's a shortcut to narcissism. And most of the people just want to be heard and to be seen, and they don't really understand for what it is they're shouting. No, the Americans haven't even. The Americans have actually, in more recent times, taken to giving us the princesses they don't want, of course. So we've got Migraine Markle, who's come back, as opposed to... although we sent her back again. She's in an unusual position. I think there's some bold legal attempt to reopen the question of Prince Harry's immigration status in the United States, which is quite entertaining. And best of luck to the people doing that. But no, we definitely sent away our most fun and exciting people. That was by definition to cross the Atlantic at that time on your own dime, in those conditions, and to found a country against the biggest empire the world has ever seen, took some chutzpah, I think. Whereas we have always been much too stultified and institutionally ossified as a nation to actually allow that kind of radicalism to take root. So, and that has its benefits as well as its pitfalls, I think. It has until recently made England a very staid, relatively principled place, which doesn't brook nonsense very often. I said until recently, of course, we've changed very much in the last few decades, but there was always something about the English character that was sort of enabled by that ossified conservatism that the Americans needed to break away from, and I'm tending to side with the Americans in their reasons for doing that, but that nevertheless gave the old country some sort of redeeming qualities. I'm not sure either has very many redeeming qualities anymore, but that's a different conversation.
It is, sadly, yes. I don't know though if radical is the right word. I mean, the many of the founding fathers, I mean, some were radical in the true sense. I mean, Thomas Paine was so radical he was kicked out by the other founders more or less and demonized for the rest of his life. Not entirely without cause, in my opinion, but I don't think he deserved quite the treatment he got. But I
Well,
mean,
if Thomas Paine had his way, America would be suffering with the National Health Service. So
yes,
it's
yes.
probably for the best that he was observed but not really taken that seriously by the people who mattered.
Mm, mm. No, he was what they said about what Kennedy said of Churchill, that he, I think it was Kennedy. Yeah, it was Kennedy, that he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. I think much the same could be said of Paine during the American Revolution with his pamphlets and so on. I mean, were it not for his
Yeah, the
pamphlets,
crisis papers. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. They wouldn't have, and common sense as well. The American army under Washington was completely galvanized by what they were reading from the pen of Paine. But my point is that many of the founding fathers were very conservative, and I'm not sure that they would have I mean, God, I can't name them now, but I remember reading that a lot of the, if not the founding fathers, is sort of foundational fathers, if you like, the early important Americans, weren't that keen on turning their back on the monarchy to core. They just got fed up of being taxed out of existence, which I think is what we're fed up of right now.
Yeah, I mean, you can go into the Federalist Papers and you can find arguments in favor of effectively recreating the institution of monarchy, albeit under an independent under independent auspices. There were legitimate arguments from the beginning as to what form America should take. We all know that the federalism versus confederate models, but before that, there was the idea of essentially a central tyrannical ruling power. And the American federal model emerges from a compromise from not two positions, but at least three. Otherwise, you could potentially have had, one of the first presidents might have been chosen for the first king, and then they would have had to have conversations about how the process of descent then works. But it's what makes it such a fascinating country. The country is itself a kind of Socratic dialogue, and what we get is the written result of that in the form of the Constitution, which had to make peace between various very vociferously opposed camps in the American founding as well. It's what makes it such an interesting country to study. It's what made it the most successful country, in my view, in the world, because every group was essentially ensured in ensuring it maintained its powers against its opponents, which is the best rule for any creation of government, the conflicting powers, to make sure that no one can rule all. But on your point about people not necessarily being opposed to England and the old monarchists, that's true. And if you go back to Thomas Paine's Crisis Papers, some of the most vituperative rhetoric is reserved for Tories, who are essentially portrayed throughout Crisis as a kind of fifth column. These are the Americans who are going to betray the American cause because they are essentially monarchists and they side with King George which George was it? Third? Yeah. George III. So there was always that tension there as well, and it's what gives America its different character from the off. The English were generally speaking more keen on the American South during the Civil War. Certainly the Manchester Guardian, which is very entertaining to remind them of, was very keen on the American South and very much hated Abraham Lincoln. And the South modelled its landed gentry off of the English style. The South modelled its social mannerisms off of the English style. The Anglo-American linguistic style is modelled in large part off of English public schools and was by and large taught in the South, with some exceptions being in states like New England. And you get that play out over time as the so-called conservative South ends up going against the more radical North, but in so doing expresses a greater fealty to its English past. It's a country of contradictions, but that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, I feel like many Americans to this day probably harbour more affection for the mother country, as it were, than their politicians have ever done.
Which is Ireland in Joe Biden's case.
Yeah, Ireland. And Obama as well. I remember reading that one of the first things Obama did when he became president was he got rid of the bust of Churchill from the Oval Office, which had been there under, a fair few presidents before him.
That's an interesting one, because the argument given at the time was that it was a routine taking out to be cleaned, and that these things do tend to go on a rota in the first place. And, I prefer to attribute to that kind of thing than malice on Obama's part, though Obama certainly had plenty of malice in him. But if you want a bigger example of a snub, I think it's Joe Biden not coming to the coronation, which is a pretty overt example of a snub in my book.
I don't know if it is, actually. My running theory there is that he is legitimately too sick to travel that far for.
He was in Ireland last week.
Yeah, but it's not the same thing. He's not required to sit for like 3 hours through a single ceremony with no immediate toilet facilities at hand. He'd have to wear a nappy.
Well, the way he walks, I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't already. But in which case, I think that's a question Americans need to ask themselves, which is that, strictly speaking, it's the most important constitutional affair of the country you still claim is your closest ally, and your president isn't physically fit to go to it. It's also a once-in-a-generation... No, it's a once-in-a-lifetime event, really, given how long it's been since the last one.
Well, it will be once-in-a-lifetime for him. Although, no, hang on. He was alive for Elizabeth.
Joe Biden was only 50 when Elizabeth II was Elizabeth I. He was about 24, but Elizabeth II. He was alive for that, but not a huge number of those. No, I don't buy the frailty argument. He is able to do foreign trips. He's able to go on longish foreign trips. He's able to sit around for a long time. What he's not able to do is give extended speeches. And it seems that, yeah, it does seem a strange decision not to go, given how many other people will be going, who are equivalently important, if not more so.
Are they sending anyone in his stead then?
It usually will be the vice president or the secretary of state who goes to events like that.
Oh God. I mean, Kamala Harris in Westminster Abbey, and it doesn't that verge on sacrilege or heresy or something like that? Desecration?
I don't know, but I do hope they give her a speech, because I like listening to Kamala Harris speak. It's
I can just picture her
Chad is suggesting
cackling.
that Joe Biden is sending his wife, so the real president will in fact be in attendance.
Yes.
So, in which case, that's fine. I still think it doesn't speak particularly well of Mr. Biden himself. Now, Kamala Harris giving any speech is always a fantastic occasion to sort of marvel at the limits to which syntax can be pushed. I very much enjoy listening to her.
A good way of putting it. I've just noticed in the chat, Harble99, if that's the way you say it, has said that no US president has ever attended a coronation.
Well, I'd have to look that up. It's believable. We don't have very many of them, so there is that to be said for it. Unlike, mind you, I mean, I suppose British heads of state don't typically attend American inaugurations, do they? Even though they are effectively the equivalent of a coronation. So I mean, maybe it isn't a point of tradition. I would have thought that it would be, though, given that however other many people will be attending. It's the usual thing that you would expect to see a head of state attend. But yeah, if none have attended in the past, that's only because we haven't had very many since America was founded, would be my answer to that one. But
That seems a fair answer. And also the fact that if you think about it, a coronation is just a complete repudiation, a complete up yours to everything America is supposed to stand for. So maybe in a way it's good that they don't attend them. Build up that wall.
You can also, it's also worth remembering on that point how relatively recent the special relationship rhetoric is. I mean, it didn't take too long for a kind of formal reconciliation after the War of Independence, when is it John Adams who becomes the first ambassador to the Court of St. James, representing America, and meets King George III, and they have a fairly nice, polite, frank exchange of views in which they basically agree they will kind of work together. But then the rest of American history throughout that period is taking in immigrants largely from countries that the British have really, really pissed off. And there's always this incredibly strong Fenian aspect to American politics throughout sort of the late 19th and through the 20th century, which means that up until relatively recent times, it would be not particularly politic for an American president to be too fawning to a British monarch, given how important the Irish electorate in America was. And that's the attitude that Joe Biden still sort of evinces when he comes to Ireland and spends his entire time in the Republic and very little, if any at all, in the North. And that can explain as well why it might seem odd to us today that a president doesn't attend the coronation, but actually in keeping with the broader sort of span of American history, it's of a piece, because it's only recently that the Fenian aspect has declined and the Irish electorate's become less important, and relations have become more normalized as England becomes more of a formal vassal state of the United States as opposed to a potential rival. And that rivalry is a really interesting aspect of Anglo-American relations. All British wartime films from the 1920s, 30s, 40s tended to be propaganda films marketed directly at Americans, which were explicitly billed and pitched as such by the British Film Board at the time as being effectively pleased to Americans to not hate us too much, because look, we really do have a lot in common, and so it's really worth getting involved in the war on our side against Hitler, because we're not your enemies anymore. And Americans did take some convincing. So
yeah, that whole question of the special relationship is actually well worth interrogating. I remember I think it was GCSE English, which for my American audience, I don't know what the equivalent of that would be, GCSEs, basically before you go to college. And we were taught Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. I think that's the title. And there's that constant refrain throughout the poem, take up the white man's burden, take up the white man's burden. And of course, I didn't know this at the time because I wasn't political, but the way that poem was taught to me and my class, this is a racist poem written by a racist because it contains the words white man and burden and so on. But actually, as you know, and this was explored by Christopher Hitchens in his book Blood, Class and Empire, it was basically a call by Kipling, who knew that the British Empire was on the way out, to the Americans, an invitation to the Americans to sort of take up the Anglosphere duty of civilizing the world and keeping it from, via the rule of law and the English language and so on, keeping it from the barbarisms of contending forces and totalitarianisms and so on. But just in a broader sense now, the special relationship cannot really be said to exist by anyone paying attention to it. It's a myth. It may have existed in, well, I know, even in Churchill's day. I mean, I'm reading Churchill's History of the Second World War at the moment, plodding through the first volumes. I think there's about 5, 6 left to go. It's fantastic stuff, but even there, just the way that he describes his dealings with America, I mean, I don't think the special relationship has been a thing ever, really.
Yes and no. I mean, I think there's an element of truth that underpins it. I mean, there is that acknowledgement of shared culture and of shared history, and most particularly of shared language. And there is the idea that it was present in the English mind, certainly towards the end of the 30s and 40s and into the 50s, that we, looking to historical analogues, as Churchill, I think himself put it, we are Greece to America's Rome. And so there is that sense in the English political class that America was destined to take up the mantle, to take up the white man's burden, if you wanted to use Kipling's formulation. And having awareness of that sort of that cultural inevitability, then also married to the shared language and the shared history and the shared culture and all of the conflict, but also all of the alliance and all of the wars that they fought against and together, does create a kind of special relationship, just not the jingoistic one that we usually think of when it's invoked by our politicians. Whenever a British Prime Minister says that we have a special relationship with America, that's usually because we need to sell more stuff to America, and the American president's being a bit hesitant about that. Whenever the Americans tell us that this is a special relationship, it's because they want us to do something for them. So Barack Obama will extol a special relationship when he tells us we really ought to remain in the European Union. George Bush will extol a special relationship when he really wants us to invade Iraq. And David Cameron would extol the special relationship when the balance of trade isn't particularly good. But given that, again, it's also important to remember...
Rishi Sunak will extol the special relationship when he reminds us
his wife's non-dom status.
His wife's non-dom, and that he himself owns a house in California, I think, and so on.
Yeah, that's a very special relationship, definitely. Yes. Well, sorry, there was another thing I was about to mention there, and it's
sorry, I interrupted you.
Mind. Where were we? Special relationship. The other thing of that is that it's also a shared legal tradition. The two foremost common law countries in the world, and America takes probably more pride today in common law than we do. We don't really remember what it means, but you will still find large parts of America which extol the virtues of common law and its precedents. And the Constitution is essentially sort of the creation ex nihilo for all common law settlement in the United States, though it did import some, it must be said. But that common language and common legal tradition ensures that I think we are the single largest foreign direct investor in the United States. They are likewise for us as well. And there's a reason that you can usually rely on these two countries to take the same side in most issues. And when not, it's weirdly enough come about at times when our politicians have kind of got on. So you had the invasion of Panama by America without informing the British first. And this was during Thatcher and Reagan's era, and Thatcher and Reagan famously got on incredibly well, and Thatcher phoned up and gave Reagan a bollocking. And he told a quite charming, humorous anecdote about that sort of after the fact. So it's, what's a little invasion between friends, I suppose. Suez being the exception. But
I hope it isn't too crass of me to point out that receiving a bollocking from Margaret Thatcher is perhaps a little more literal than metaphorical.
Oh God, yeah, everyone knows Margaret Thatcher was the top in any relationship. Yeah, that's fine.
No, Suez is a good point. We're right to raise it. I mean, so much for the special relationship. The Americans were threatening to blow us out of the water if we proceeded down the Suez Canal. That myth was destroyed that day. And actually, one of the things that annoys me about special relationship rhetoric now isn't that politicians engage in it. I mean, that they're venal specimens. It doesn't surprise me that they do it. It's the journalistic class in Britain. Who, I have not very many nice things to say about the journalistic class in this country at all, anyway. But they will replicate that language and that myth without the slightest examination of it. They will just assume that it's still a thing, and all you have to do all you have to do is invoke it, and it is still true thereby. It's ridiculous.
It is. I mean, you have. There's been an interesting inversion over time, I think, in the British, particularly the British cultural attitude to America. So the anti-Americanism has always been a reasonably strong, latent force in British politics, but it used to be more of an aristocratic thing. So the aristocracy, Evelyn Waugh sort of has this in the subtext of a number of his books. The British aristocracy found itself running out of money, effectively, through the 1910s and the 1920s, and the Americans had no class, but lots of money. And so what Americans tended to do, if they were scions of big families or business magnates who wanted to establish for themselves this big cultural footprint, what they would do is they would come over to the old country, they would bring their money, and they would bail out the aristocracy in order to marry into it. So they get class, and the old aristocracy gets money. Which breeds resentment, obviously, and nobody likes being bought out in any relationship by somebody who's richer and more successful than they are. And there's that element of cultural snobbery, because most Americans of the time, big business people, would be considered nouveau riche at best, if not just incredibly lucky proles, who didn't know how to behave and didn't have the manners and weren't well brought up. And so anti-Americanism at that time was quite snobbish, and it was the aristocracy who didn't particularly like the Americans, even as they relied on them. I think that's changed over time as our own aristocracy has sort of faded from view, and really it sort of bred itself out of existence. There aren't very many true aristocrats left in England. They are all basically Americanized. They are then more comfortable with the transatlantic stuff than perhaps our working classes these days, because the working class has a stronger cultural memory of what, in a weird way, manners and etiquette are supposed to be. At any rate, they don't particularly like the idea of their nation being playing second fiddle to somebody else's. And so now when you find sort of boilerplate anti-Americanism, I think it comes from lower down the social spectrum than it used to. Back in the day, it was the working class aspiration to do what the Americans did, which is to make a life for yourself, to break free of your cloistering and stifling elites in order to make a life. Whereas now, we've basically given up on that, and the aristocracy is very much in bed with the Americans, and that's their idea of culture. It's this weird mix of American consumerism and European sort of faux political identity, which really drives the upper classes these days. And so, yeah, that American antipathy has just shifted down the social spectrum, which is a shame, because I still think, to the extent America has a lead to give in the world culturally, it should be to the working classes everywhere, which is that you just do what we did and you will be as successful as we are. That's the premise of the American dream, and that's why it attracted so many of the poor and the dispossessed to the shores to begin with.
Yes, give me your tired and weary, or whatever the language is, on the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
Two points there, though. I mean, on the aristocracy, you said that we don't really have an aristocracy anymore, certainly not in the old sense, and I think that is obviously true. The aristocracy now, though, is, in a sense, no less blood-based. Many of the politicians and journalists, who obviously, they may as well be synonymous in British culture, as far as I can see, in the sense that the journalists parrot and are in bed with the politicians. They are part of scions, if that's the correct word. They're part of bloodlines. Look at the Dimblebys, for instance.
Toynbees.
Yeah,
the Chakrabartis, or
yeah, there we go.
There's a huge number of these. Jack Straw, his son, I think, is around in politics.
The Miliband's, although you don't really see much of them anymore.
The Benns, Hilary Benn.
Exactly, Hilary Benn.
Ben's daughter, I think, is also somewhere in politics.
Toynbee.
Yeah, the Toynbees, obviously. Yeah, no, you're right. There's still a blood base of. I mean, David Goodhart has a book out at the moment, I think, called The New Elites. And The New Elites is probably the best way of putting it. So I wouldn't call them the aristocracy, in the sense that I think that's a word best reserved for something which is dead, because it carries certain sort of cultural etiquette and historical connotations that the modern elite doesn't have. But there is still a huge divide between the modern new elite, the new aristocrats and the old aristocrats. And you're right, that's partly blood-based, because we are and always have been, a very nepotistic culture. It's very hard to get anywhere in British society in the upper echelons unless you're married to or descended from someone who's already made it. And they tend to be the people who've descended from people who made it before them. And in some senses, they are the descendants of the old aristocrats, because that's the position that they're maintaining through their nepotism. It's just that they've lost the cultural trappings and all redeeming features.
Oh, exactly, yeah. And I mean, I like using the word aristocrat of these people precisely because it annoys them to be reminded how they got where they are. Uh, but I'm reminded in everything you're saying of a lovely quote from Evelyn Waugh, which is that in puberty we're American, we die French, meaning I think I think what he means is nowadays, and even in his day in the 60s, but sure, I think he died in 64, so he was already seeing this come into being, evidently. Uh, British youth are American in the sense that they listen to American music. They are subject to American cultural forces and political forces, Black Lives Matter being, a movement that we are obviously subject to, and it's flooded into university campuses, American ideology, critical race theory, all of this sort of stuff. Our tastes, our I don't want to piss off my American viewers. I love America. Don't get me wrong, but they might perhaps understand what I mean when I say a certain cultural crassness. We expect many other institutions to ape what American institutions do, police being among them, um, and then we die French. I think means we eventually grow out of this, or at least most people do, and we become Europeans to the extent that we repudiate English and British culture. Um, Although, having said that, we never really adopted it in the first place. One of the things that seems to me endemic in people our age in this country is that they can go their whole lives and not really engage with or feel any affection for the culture they should belong to. So that they brought up on all these American influences, and they die thinking that the best thing they can do with their time is go on a holiday in France and drink French wine. And they'll die not having inhabited the place that they've lived this whole time, namely England or Britain. So I think there's a lot in Waugh's quote which touches upon a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the other aspect of that is that, to think American in your youth is essentially a code for saying that you are ambitious, you are bold, you are gregarious, you're outgoing, you have ambitions, you believe you can achieve something in the world off your own back. And that might not be recognized by the stultified cultural elite around you, but what you are is not conservative, you are radical in that sense. You will prove yourself by your own deeds. As America, that's pretty much what the American dream represents to people who, I like to think it still represents that to a large number of Americans, though a decreasing number, but it's certainly what it represents to a large number of people outside America. It's the thing that you aspire to when you want to achieve something in life. You want to be given the sense that you can achieve it if you try. As people grow up and mature and by and large fail to meet these things because we don't live in America and we're not as allowed to do that as we would be if we did, the sort of temptation to lapse into sort of camp social conservatism of the French mold, which is to say, well, we can't make anything, but look at all of these really lovely old buildings. They're basically ours. This is our cultural heritage. We didn't make them. We had no say in their construction. We're not even doing a very good job of maintaining them, but we're going to say that they're ours, and we're going to place our entire identity in these crumbling but very pretty ruins because we have nothing to speak of for ourselves. That, to my mind, is more sort of the Europe versus America thing. I don't quite think that would be what War had in mind, but it's something you can repurpose.
Yeah, on that actually, I know that you don't like rugby, but I do. And a few years ago now, well, actually, it might be about 10 years ago at this point. The French national team had a player called Chabal, I think was his name.
Was he
Massive,
very tall and hairy?
very tall and hairy. That's the one. Yeah, looks like a Neanderthal. He wasn't even that good, but he was massive. He was brutal. And there's this famous interview. If you YouTube it, everyone can watch it. Um, he's in this. If memory serves, he's being interviewed by, I think, an English interviewer, and the game took place in France. And anyway, this interviewer is annoying Chabal, and he turns around and he says, "We are in France. We speak French. We are in France. We speak French." And he walks off. And I bring that up because Macron did something similar not too long ago. And he wasn't saying, we're in France, we speak French, but he was sticking up for French culture. I can't remember exactly what it was he was referring to, but he was basically saying the same thing. And I'm not a fan of Macron, I have to say, but he was absolutely right on this point, and the French are much better at this than we are. He was sticking
Yeah.
up for French culture against its discontents. And he articulated this point of view very coherently, and I think he actually believed it as well, and that's the salient point.
I think no, I
Whereas
think he
you
does, but
can
it's because
find
he has the
just sorry,
Jupiterian mindset. He has the mindset which places himself. He does believe that about France, but he believes it about France principally because he believes that as Jupiter, he is the sun god of France. So
yeah,
it's self
the
ennobling to extol the virtues of French society if you believe that you embody all of French society.
yeah.
I've never liked him more than when he does that. Actually, there was one time when he was going through the streets and some young person came up to him. I say that
I
as though we're
saw
not
that.
young people, but some young person that is not as nice as we are came up to him and was being very pally, and he basically said, "No, I am the president, and you speak to me with respect. This is the French culture." I said, I don't hate you for doing this. I hate you for everything else, but that's okay. That's fairly admirable. Whereas by contrast, I mean, to use another sports example, a very similar thing happens. It was Tim Howard, who used to play in golf for the United States for football, an actual sport that people like to watch. And they were playing. I think they were playing Mexico or something. Or they were playing in one of the southern states bordering Mexico. I don't remember which. And after the game, I don't know if some stadium announcement was made in Spanish or some interviewer was asking him a question in Spanish, and he said, "No, we're in America. Speak English. This is the national language." And he was pilloried by the usual suspects in the American press for being effectively racist, because how dare you suggest that your language is a part of your cultural identity? That's actually not something that the Anglosphere is very good at. The Francophone regions are much better at that sense of cultural preservation, and we sort of brush up against that because we believe it to be sort of cruel and discriminatory and in some sense illiberal, as though liberalism just means no standards whatsoever. Yeah, that is something I do admire about the French, and I
Yeah, well,
think
the
we
French
and the Americans could
on
learn
the
more.
language front, they obviously have the Académie Française, which is this centralized institution which exists to determine what enters the French language and what doesn't, and they're pretty strict about that. And English, you just couldn't do that with English. It's too ravenous a language. It just
Yeah, but I
it
mean
sees a
that makes
foreign
the English
word and
language more interesting. I think that that's
yeah,
slightly distinct from the idea of whether or not you should preserve English as the language of your nation, if that is the language of your nation, and whether some state body should be in charge of the language. That's the defect of the French model, which is that if it's important, there's some state body to govern it,
yeah.
which is the opposite of the English way, and there's not coincidentally the reason that our way is much more successful than theirs.
Yeah, well, as I say in my last video, The Death of Oratory, I mean, the French and Italians, and I know this to be the case because I have among European countries, in fact, among any foreign countries that don't speak English, France and Italy are the countries of which I have the most experience. And I know for a fact that they teach their children, okay, this is proper Italian, this is proper French. It's not good to speak this other way. You are supposed to take some pride in the way that you not so much pronounce as just the way that you comport yourself in the language. You're not supposed to be crass with it. Um, but I did want to contrast Boris Johnson with Macron when Macron was sticking up for French culture and it's attacking its discontent, because there's this clip of Boris Johnson and he's doing his usual dithering like maybe you're woke, and that's of course obviously that's not good, but anyway, let's go and milk a cow, shall we? The classic Boris act, and it is an act. um and the point is that it's completely incoherent. He's not engaging with the point. He has no real grasp of the seriousness of the woke issue, partly because we still insist on calling it woke, as I am now, and it's actually, I think, a rather deeper issue than that. But it's just an amazing contrast. Again, I'm no fan of Macron, but he obviously takes it seriously, and he's looking upon the Anglosphere with horror, as I think most of the world is, and obviously Russia and China and other enemies are capitalizing on the fact that the Anglosphere is eating itself and doesn't know how to respond to it. But
The irony of
yeah,
that being that all of the ideas we're implementing in the academy are French.
I know.
So
Yes, yeah.
Macron actually did say this at one point. He said we don't want to see the American cultural. I don't know if he called it a cultural virus, but it was something synonymous with that. We don't want that coming over here. So well, you gave it to them. It's already here. It's just that for some reason. Well, no, I think it's not for some reason. The French have a more sort of a much stronger, latent, and particularly working class form of cultural conservatism than America does. In that sense, cultural conservatism as opposed to sort of intuitive political conservatism. And so the French sort of are more vociferous in resisting this, whereas it's swept through the institutions of America much more effectively because it appeals to the cultural elites who, though they fancy themselves to have this power in France, kind of don't, or at least they're restricted in their ability to do things largely through the profound dysfunction of the French state. But it is interesting to note how, in Macron's mind, yes, these particularly French ideas from Foucault and Derrida and the like, they're an American virus, apparently, even though they came up in the French Academy. They spoke French. They were born in France in many cases. They wrote in French. They commented on French culture, and they really spread their ideas in France to begin with. If anything, it's just that America is a little way behind France in seeing these ideas destroy the constitution of a republic. It did that in France. The Fourth through Fifth Republic is largely a response to the prototype woke ideas of the 1960s, the late 1960s, which were implemented and much more forcefully expressed by French students in particular. Charles de Gaulle, in an act of supreme self-sacrifice, does away with effectively himself, but also the Fourth Republic, in order to ensure that this kind of thing can't really happen again. And America doesn't have a de Gaulle figure, and so it might be that America is just simply currently going through, in some part, not you can overextend the analogy, but in some part it's going through what the Fourth Republic did, which I think is interesting given where that ended.
In this sense, that the French have been inoculated against their own disease. I mean, they've been there, done that. Now they're watching other people catch the disease. Oh dear.
Yeah, there's an old, I say old, there's was it late 2000s, mid 2000s, a Canadian French film called Pontypool, which I quite like. It's a weird little thing. It's a low budget affair. I don't think there's any recognizable people in it. And it follows these American Canadian or English Canadian radio DJs in their studio, where the sort of the drama, much of the drama unfolds off screen. There's rumors of this disease, this outbreak that's driving people mad. It's turning them into not zombies, but sort of those sort of infected type people who go around madly killing and eating people.
Oh, was this the thing I watched at yours?
I don't know, possibly, maybe, I don't recall. But the revelation that comes later on, and I think is also to do with the fact that the film is largely funded by the Quebec side of Canada, is that the language is contained within the English. The disease is contained within the English language itself, and so they all have to speak in deliberate nonsense in order to dispel the sort of the magic of language that's falling over people. So the English speakers are going mad, and the only way to preserve yourself against this is either to speak French or to divorce English words entirely from their meaning, which is it's a really quirky little film, which I don't think had any grand aspirations of itself, but has become a little bit more relevant now because it actually has sort of preempted what is going on in modern culture and the way that the French do seem to be much more resistant to these ideas than the English speakers do.
That is a fantastically atavistic film, by the sounds of it. The people who survive, the people who flourish, the superior people speak this language. The inferior people who are going crazy speak that language.
They do. I'd want to know how popular Justin Trudeau is, though, in the French regions of Canada, because I think that will prove how accurate it is to real life or not. Because Trudeau is a really good example of the infection of the English language. If he underperforms in the French region of Canada, then maybe the film was actually prophetic. If he's quite popular in the French region of Canada, then maybe it wasn't. Although I have a vague recollection that actually, I can't speak French words, but the guy has a French-sounding surname, Pierre Poilievre, the Canadian Conservative leader, is
I know him.
More
He
popular,
seems cool.
more popular than Trudeau in Quebec as well. I think he has this weird coalition of rural Canada across the language divide. So maybe Pontypool was a prophetic film.
Well, someone here is in the chat again. Harble99 is saying that Pontypool is Welsh, actually.
Yeah, but you know it won't be pronounced like that. Nothing Welsh sounds like the way it's spelled.
No. Oh God, I can't believe Trudeau's still in power, though. I was going to say, I mean, you said you don't speak any French, and I only speak a tiny fraction of French, but I find French more intelligible than anything Trudeau says in English.
Yes, but that's as a result of the mind virus, isn't it? I mean, I've listened to a few of Trudeau's speeches in the Canadian House of Commons, And it really is astonishing just how much of a budget Obama the guy is, and not just because he also likes to pretend to be black occasionally, but that weird sort of very, well, quite effeminate actually, but very fawning sense of supreme moral self-righteousness and that complete inability to answer a straight question with a straight answer.
Oh
Overtly
yeah, but
moralistic.
this is the same with Ardern
Yes.
and well, God, there are so many politicians who fit that mold. I'm struggling to think of them. But Ardern is because obviously she resigned, didn't she?
She did.
Recently. Oh, also Nicola Sturgeon as well. I mean, if you're talking about moral righteousness, Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, God, the look on that face is one of basically I am the second coming.
Yeah, that's how she carries herself as well. And there was Ms. Marin as well of Finland, who
Oh
also
yeah,
recently was done away with. But these were sort of the trifecta of woke that were held up by all of the liberal commentariat as the second coming of
coming
Christ
turn.
in three forms, a proper trinity of the female goddess. And they've all in different ways failed, but they've also sort of failed upwards. I think were it not for Nicola Sturgeon's curious relationship with the law,
And the
she
truth.
probably would have been elevated to a higher position than the mere First Minister of Scotland, like Ardern has been. It's no coincidence that Jacinda Ardern accomplishes absolutely nothing on the legislative agenda. She accomplishes none of her goals. She fails to meet every benchmark she set. She just gives vague, sort of wishy-washy good intentions that please the cultural elite. She accomplishes nothing, and then she's immediately elevated to somewhere which actually has power, which is she's given a tenured professorship at Harvard, I think, and she's on the board of some international body countering hate speech, where you know she'll be much more effective. And that's usually the conveyor belt. You don't have to be very effective on the governing level anymore because governance is very unfashionable. And so the same thing with Marin. Marin comes in, she's immediately held up because she's so hyper fashionable. She's very good looking. She knows how to speak to young people. She says all of the right things. She can't govern worth a damn, but governance is not very important anymore because all you really need to do is to establish yourself this big reputation that allows you to be cherry-picked by some supranational body which really does have power, and that's where you do your best, the best of your bad work. I think Nicola Sturgeon would have faced the same fate had it not been for the fact she resigned almost certainly because she knew what was coming in terms of the SNP's finance scandal. But
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I mean, this is precisely why the SNP were in favour of joining the European Union because failed, incompetent, barely
after they
elected,
weren't. Yeah.
democratically illegitimate politicians such as, well, actually, I say that she was democratically legitimate, unfortunately. Were it not, maybe if Tony Blair hadn't existed, maybe we wouldn't be talking in this manner. But she wanted to join the European Parliament. She wanted to join the European Union. That's where she would have received some form of, long-term recognition and a fat pension.
Yeah, and also the ear of people who are able to impose policy without having to go through the rigmarole of actually convincing people that the policy is the right idea.
Exactly.
Most of these people fundamentally dislike the basic processes of democratic governance. That's quite well known. Justin Trudeau famously doesn't like this kind of thing. It's why his government is racked with scandal. It's just that the sort of the more pliant media in Canada, which is to say all the state-funded aspects of the media in Canada, simply won't report on the fact that, for example, it seems like his entire governing party has been half elected by the enterprises of the Chinese Communist Party, or the fact that his online streaming act has now come into force, which gives his government the power to effectively determine what Canadians are allowed to see, what might even be forced to appear in their streams, in a bid to extort social media companies based in America into donating more money to the Canadian arts sector. The same thing is sort of true in the United States. The most unelectable member of the United States Congress is also the most popular online member of the United States Congress. That's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is also the most useless member of the United States Congress in terms of actually getting legislation passed. You can just chart the number of things she's sponsored, or that she's written, or co-signed, or co-sponsored. She is either at the bottom of that list or second bottom of that list. And yet, who do we never stop talking about when we think of left-wing progressive American congresspeople? Well, it's AOC. She's democratically useless. She's useless in government, but she doesn't see that as her ultimate purpose in life. She doesn't see that as being the most effective way of gaining change. Tucker Carlson gets yeeted from Fox News, and she goes on Instagram and says, deplatforming works, satisfied sigh. that's what she sees power as being. It's not democratic anymore. It's purely demotic.
She
And the
doesn't
same
appear
thing is true with
to
Sturgeon and
consider
everybody
it an
else.
honor either. To me, that's the worst thing. She doesn't appear
No,
to consider it an honor to be a
she
Congress.
always gives you the impression that she's doing everybody else a favor.
Yeah,
Much
yeah.
like Justin
As though we
Trudeau as well.
needed her.
They believe they're too good to be in this position, but they're doing it for the people, even though they know it's not the best means of doing things for the people. They are contemptible people, but it's so common across the world at this point, and particularly the Anglosphere, that it can't be a coincidence that you have this. It is disproportionately female, but well, Justin Trudeau on certain days can be classed as such. It's disproportionately female, disproportionately social media savvy, disproportionately, if not ignorant of, then outright hostile to the normal business of democratic governance and actually getting laws passed and bills passed and winning elections. But they do know how to control a megaphone and how to get a very supportive audience online. And to their credit, they achieve things. Wouldn't ever claim that none of these people have ever achieved anything. I just think that everything they have achieved has been pretty terrible, to be honest, in terms of its cultural impact and its political impact and the way it further divides an already divided demos.
Well, in the words of Marco Genovese in the chat, AOC is my favorite big booty Latina. Now, you've mentioned, you've accused Justin Trudeau of being feminine twice now. And obviously in this day and age, he need only say the word and he would be a woman.
Are we sure that there aren't photos yet to emerge?
Well, I don't know. He's done blackface so many times. It wouldn't. He's obviously one of those sort of spirit, sort of intermediary beings that we hear so much about.
I've
from
always wondered what
indigenous
the
tribal
two spirit
cultures
thing
who
means
can
in the acronym.
change between
2S. It's Justin Trudeau.
But no, I don't just say that to make a cheap, funny point. It's relevant. So you and I have spoken in private before about how women are more pro-social than men, and
Yes.
you know more about that than me. So first of all, for the
Yes, I
audience,
do know more about women than you. You're absolutely right.
first of all, for the audience, why don't you just give a sort of tweet-length definition of pro-sociality? And second of all, oh God, I can never remember my sources. This is a terrible, terrible habit to have, terrible flaw to have. But I remember reading recently how woke, and again, I hate that word, the mallard, which if you don't know what that is, it's a really good sort of grassroots conservative publication in the UK. Refuses to publish authors who use the word woke in their pieces, which I think is an interesting tactic. But nevertheless, the woke phenomenon, and I have some experience of this as well, the HR industry, it's flush with not just with woke ideas, but women. HR is I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's over at least 70% women in the HR industry. Now, I happen to know, thanks to YouTube analytics, that the majority of my audience is male. But in case there are any women who are fans of my channel or your channel,
C3PO's in the chat, and I know he's a woman at least once a week, so you've
well,
got half of one.
congratulations, Z3PO. I'm really proud of you. Yeah, I don't wish to offend the women watching if there are any, but it seems to me that this is a rich topic worthy of discussion. To what extent? Because you often hear conservatives talk. Well, you hear conservatives talk a lot of things, much of it nonsense, but the de-Christianization of society, the Islamization of society, but also the feminization of society, and you're hearing a lot of that at the moment with this whole Andrew Tate business. And just to be clear, I think Andrew Tate is utterly despicable. I can't stand him. I cannot stand him. In fact, Morgoth's review, and a few of you in the chat have said very kindly that it was my conversation with Morgoth that led you to my channel. Morgoth recently tweeted this clip that Andrew Tate, who I think is on bail or has been released, of Andrew Tate sitting in a darkened sort of smoking room in a leather chair, smoking a cigar, shirtless, listening to rap music. And Morgoth said, if this is your idea of masculinity, you're basically a moron. And then he posted this lovely old vintage photograph of a father, with a pot belly and a beard, holding up a fish with his son on a fishing trip, and that was true masculinity. But that's beside the point. I want to know, the Little Platoon, what your opinion of the role of femininity and of womanhood is in the social contagion that we are choosing to call woke.
And that's all going to be tweet length, right? So, okay. I mean, Andrew Tate's a really good sort of launching pad for this stuff. I've seen bits and pieces of him. I think he's really interesting to study as a kind of social phenomena. I don't know anyone who compensates so hard for having such a small penis and then managing to make that come across as masculine. How performative it is as well. If you ever watch him, everything about him, the way he carries himself, the way he speaks, the things that he boasts of, the things that he shows on camera, the things he flaunts, like very fast, expensive-looking cars or a really nice-looking house, all the time when he's wearing this stupid shirt buttoned down to like the second button, which is barely even on. And then this weird head which looks just so perfectly like an egg. And it's so unattractive, but he's undeniably incredibly charismatic, and every single thing he's playing on is a cliched idea of masculinity, but more importantly, it's an ideal of masculinity that has been quite particularly demonized over the last really 10 years, if not longer. He's a parody of what men are told they're not allowed to be. And the danger with someone like Andrew Tate is that if you tell enough men that they're not allowed to be basically men, then you are going to drive more of them into the arms of somebody like Andrew Tate, who is abnormally incurious, unintelligent, weirdly, is aggressive even the right word? He masquerades aggressiveness because, again, that seemed to be a cliche male trait. And you just sort of get the impression that he would fold in an instant if you were ever put to any sort of physical challenge. He's harmful, though, because he also perpetuates these incredibly bizarre sort of social attitudes that, again, men are expected to hold, or his weird parody of man is expected to hold. You're expected to be incredibly offensive toward women. You're expected to be at least casually homophobic. You're expected to be incredibly unsubtle in the way that you speak. So, if you don't like a thing, the thing is gay. And yeah, there's a weird video of him that did the rounds a while ago of him basically did this weird sort of faux Socratic thought experiment where he says, is it gayer to sleep with an attractive transsexual, as in somebody who is just cross-dressing essentially, than it is to sleep with an ugly woman? And he seemed to think that sleeping with the person with a penis was actually less gay than sleeping with the ugly woman, because I don't actually recall his reasoning because he doesn't really have any of that. But he's entirely a response, and he's preying on people who don't really have a huge amount of stake in modern society because they've had that denied to them. He's a corrupted form of masculinity, and going further toward the origin of your question, the corruption of that masculinity does, I think, come in part from the increasing, not to sound too much like him, feminization of society, which is that you have decades of trying to encourage more women into the workplace and into politics, which is, there's nothing right or wrong about that. If you believe in quotas one way, you believe in them the other way. If you believe quotas are bad one way, you have to believe quotas are bad in every way. It's not that we should say women can't be in politics. Obviously, that's absurd. To say that women should be in politics by virtue of being women is likewise absurd, in my opinion. And yes, but you have all of these decades worth of work, which then creates entire new industries and entire new very important sectors within established industries. You mentioned HR being an important one. You also have the increasing divide in old style sectors of the economy, education being a classic example. Education used to be a reasonably male-dominated, quite conservative institution, and is quite dramatically, and over a relatively short period of time, come to be almost 90% female, with the resultant liberalization, so to speak, of social attitudes being preached in education. To the pro-social point, the effect of all of this is that women consistently, doesn't matter where in the world you poll them, women score much higher in terms of what you would call pro-social behavior. They are much less tolerant of divergent views, but they do prioritize kindness more, but paradoxically are much less patient with people who are seen to be unkind. You can then chart that through to basically the founding character of wokeness. What is wokeness? Wokeness is essentially the idea that you have to be kind or else. And the or else is the important point. Or else you are going to be exorcised. Generally speaking, and this is generally speaking, there are of course anecdotal exceptions, but generally speaking, women tend to score higher on any political policy question which has collective means to achieve collective ends. They believe that society as a whole should benefit from policy, as opposed to the individual being allowed to flourish through society and benefiting society through competition, which is sort of much more of a traditionally masculine trait. So combining all these things together, you have the increasing, well, the dominance, in fact, of women in education, the increasing prevalence of women in the workplace, which gives rise to HR departments, which are, again, almost uniformly stacked by women or gay men. And these have immense cultural power. And the increased presence of women in politics, to a degree we've not really seen, I don't think, since women's suffrage first came about. And you get relatively predictable results. What was one of the first major social policy questions that was answered after women's suffrage was passed? All the men buggered off to fight in the war, the women passed prohibition because they were sick of their husbands coming back and getting drunk and ruining the place. But that's a socially collectivist sense of tolerance, but intolerant of people who diverge from that. We're having much the same thing. The woke movement is prohibitionist in its own right. And that prohibition is not uniformly, but it is largely driven, I think, by the increased prevalence of women in society. You see that in other areas, in pop culture as well. For example, like I'm reviewing the new Peter Pan adaptation at the moment. And I went back because it interested me and watched the 1953 version and the 2003 version, and then read J.M. Barrie's novel just to see what the differences were. And it is remarkable how this same character, written by men in every single instance, has morphed from the person who espouses the ideals of motherhood and the differentness and arguably the betterness in J.M. Barrie's mind of being a woman. More intelligent than boys, more grown up than boys at a much younger age, more enlightened, less silly, less likely to fall out of their perambulators and end up in Neverland and all the rest of that. But nevertheless motivated by jealousy because they are older than boys and that they feel the effects of unrequited love earlier than boys do, which animates the entire story of Peter Pan going forwards. And then you compare it to the most recent adaptation where there is no romance. All of the girls love each other instantly as soon as they meet. Their entire dialogue tree is essentially, you're brilliant, no, you're even better, no, but you're beautiful, no, you're more beautiful than that. And that's another expression of sort of the general pro-social attitudes of women. If you listen to teenage girls speak to each other when they're all in the same room, they speak in much this way. They're all very complimentary. Then you listen to them speak about the friend who left the room, and it's very, very different because they're all ganging up on the person who's become the out-group. Men don't have this. Men have their own flaws as well. There's an equivalent of the Mary Sue dominated by men, the Mary Sue being that classic example of the fan fiction insert who is a girl written by girls. The idealized form of femininity in the mind of a teenage girl. The men have the equivalent, the Gary Sue. The Gary Sue, though, is very different, and it explains the difference between sort of female pro-social behavior and male domineering behavior. The Gary Sue is more the Arnold Schwarzenegger mold in any given action film of the 50s. Doesn't require social affirmation, but does want to impose will upon society. He's recognized for his deeds and for his exploits and for how mammothly strong he is, and because he can beat up the most people. And then he earns reward for that. He's celebrated, but it's not the sort of social reinforcing acclamation that women tend to do when they're writing characters they believe to be popular. That's an incredibly long and multifaceted answer to your question, but I think I've been speaking for too long, so.
Well, not long enough, actually. I don't know where to begin with that. Jesus. Well, I mean, okay, well, this is worth mentioning. I think whoever the hell Harble is, Harble99, he said, or she, see your friends blown to hamburger in front of you and try to cope without a drink, girls. Feminism does not acknowledge male pain. Camille Paglia, who was also one of the I mean, I know that she's a feminist, and actually I don't think she identifies as a woman, Camille Paglia, but she was one of the ones who what were the prequels called in Star Wars? The
prequels: Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith.
Revenge of the Sith, that's the one. She was lauding Revenge of the Sith as one of the best movies ever made ever, which I think is I can get behind that. So woke is well, okay. There's one thing I want to latch on, the prohibition stuff, because we've talked about this before. I like a drink, as you know. I know that you like a drink, somewhat less than you used to, but you like a drink. many studies, show that the current I lose track of the generations now with the Y, Z, X, Epsilon. I don't know.
We've now reverted. I think the current one, born after 2010, is Generation Alpha.
Alpha.
So
Well,
yeah,
I was 95. You were
no, the
94.
internet just knows that I was born in the 90s. It doesn't need to know any more than that.
All right, I won't divulge your age. No one needs to know that you're as old as Yoda. Um, we drink less. We drink far less. We have the highest percentage of teetotalers of any generation, I think, that's ever existed. And it's worse than that. We're not just teetotal. We go in for the substitutes. A 0 alcohol% beer, which is a bit like decaffeinated coffee. There's no point. Just quickly, Angel Messenger, who I think you know. Do you know Angel Messenger?
I don't think so. The name escapes me if I do.
Okay, well, I think she has written in the chat, "I won't take offense, Oski, you're forgiven." So I think she is perhaps the sole female viewer at the moment. So I'm glad you haven't taken offense. But no, the prohibitionary aspect of all this is interesting because it is clearly there. I myself have met more women in my life who don't drink or refuse to drink and make a point of it than I have men. And I have met more women who are woke than I have met men who are woke. But although somehow, for some reason, the woke men are infinitely more contemptible than the woke women. And as I say, having some exposure to HR in the past, I know that women are much more represented in that industry than men are, and that industry is very much woke. I'm not sure what your experience of the gender disparity, I suppose you could say, is.
I couldn't put a direct proportion on it. I think research has been done which suggests that it is quite significantly disproportionately female-led in an HR department. But that's because the HR departments are kind of like the commissars of a Puritanism. And Puritanism back in the day was also quite a female-dominated thing. There's no one quite so vicious as an old Victorian convent nun, if put in charge of children, for example, or put in charge of their husbands, more to the point. But so the Puritanism aspect comes out, but it has different expressions in terms of its political implications. So it's interesting to note, and I think I'm right in saying this, when the question of women's suffrage was first put forward, the biggest opposition to the cause of women's suffrage actually came from the left at the time, from the sort of the nascent Labour Party and the more sort of lefty wing of the old Liberal Party, because they believed that if women were given the vote, they would disproportionately go Conservative, as indeed they did. And so they fought it much more staunchly than many Conservatives did. But that was because the Conservatism at the time was a collectivist enterprise, as against the Liberal Party, which was less so, and the Labour Party, which hadn't really yet formed its ideas about what collectivism and individualism really meant. The Conservative Party of the day being a more collective means of achieving collective ends, and standing for the kind of social mores that appeal to people with an overtly sort of pro-social outlook on life. That was, of course, the place to which women did indeed flock in their frocks when they were given the vote. That's changed a little bit since sort of the 90s. Well, when did conservatism sort of take its more liberal bent? Since the 1970s, really, both in America and the United Kingdom, when conservatism marries with the old liberal inclination, and you get conservatives as being at least partly liberal in our sense, or libertarian in the American sense, and more sort of in favor of individual personal freedom than collectivized social policy. Collectivism becomes much more staunchly and definitely something of the left, and concordantly, women today do tend to vote more left-wing than their male husbands do, and tend to be more collectivist, which partly motivates that desire. But this is all on the political level. You can get much more sort of granular than that, and it's still very interesting to note the differences. At the risk of getting you looked askance at by YouTube, because it's always controversial discussing anything to do with sort of transgenderism. But it's interesting to note, for example, the demography of people who were referred to gender transition clinics before 2010 versus after 2010, and particularly before 2020 and after 2020, so during lockdown. Because up until sort of the last 5 years, it was always a tiny, tiny, tiny share of the population, but I think it was slightly over proportion to be men who were referred to gender recognition clinics up until around sort of 2015 at a guess, I think it was, at which point you have, I think it's like a 316, I might be putting these numbers out of my ass, but it's this ballpark figure, something like 316 or is it even 3016% increase of the number of young girls being referred to transition clinics, which was, and this is the argument for social contagion, which is that it's such a big change in demography in such a short period of time that it can't really be explained by anything else other than social contagion. People who doubt social contagion tend to overstress the sort of the role of young people and their agency and their sense of individuality. Young people are very, very not aware of themselves. And it's also no coincidence, and it's related, in other words, that when you have that phenomenon of TikTok Tourette's, also during lockdown, I think it was, when people are locked in their homes, locked on social media, lots of young girls started following TikTok influencers who had Tourette's or claimed to have Tourette's. And you had a vast increase in the number of young girls, almost all young girls, presenting themselves to doctors and to psychologists, demonstrating symptoms of Tourette's that were not normal of Tourette's, because most people with Tourette's have specific symptoms to their own upbringing. They have specific sort of tics, which are you can categorize them as being natural. But every single girl who turned up had distinctively British Tourette's, no matter where in the world they came from. So in America, you would have an American girl from the Deep South presenting at a psychologist, presenting as a British person with Tourette's. And it was such a dramatic increase in cases that, again, there is only one explanation for it, which is a social contagion aspect. And when you then consider that, yes, young girls generally and women generally are more pro-social, they do look to social reinforcement more than men do, that is largely to do with difference in psychology between sexes. And it happens all over the world, which means it can't really be a cultural thing either. Men have their own pitfalls. I'm not just shitting on women. I mean, there's a reason most mass shooters are men. There's a reason most domestic violence perpetrators are men. There's a reason people who engage in individualized acts of indiscriminate violence tend to be men. But women have particularly social vulnerabilities, which produce particularly social phenomena, and including particularly social crimes. And woke is kind of a social crime. So
that's a good way of putting it. Do you think that the extent to which men seek social confirmation is also the extent to which they are being feminine, so to speak? And by extension, do you think that they shouldn't do that? Is the proper role of men to do what thou or they wilt, as it were, and not care what other men or indeed women think of them?
Well, it depends. I mean, are we saying the proper role is in what I think should happen, or the proper role is in what does happen?
Well, it's always more interesting to know what other people think should happen.
I am a libertarian where that's concerned. I don't have views on what other people should do as long as they leave me out of it.
Oh, come now! That's a boring answer.
No,
Libertarians are boring for that reason.
Well, then you can
be dogmatic.
Well, you'd have to be more specific. I mean, do I think that men should, by and large, take out their frustration by going up and shooting up schools? No. I think that's probably a bad thing. Women don't tend to do that very often, unless they're transitioning, as we saw quite recently. So no, I think men are much better placed exploring more of a feminine aspect to their character without overly feminizing themselves. But what I think should happen is kind of irrelevant given what we've been saying about, and the whole thrust of the preceding argument, which is that there are certain aspects of psychology which do tie, at least partly, to your biological sex. And these will always express themselves no matter what social conditioning you impose upon people. So, you can go to, I think Jordan Peterson cites the example of egalitarian policies in the Nordic countries and in Sweden, which actually reinforce gender stereotypes and stereotypical gender roles as opposed to diminishing them, which is what they were intended to do. Society can tell men not to be men all at once, but it won't really succeed. All it will succeed in is creating resentment and resentment and giving rise to the kind of person like Andrew Tate who is effectively a male reactionary. Which I don't think is a very good thing. I hate that sort of traditional aspect of masculinity as being very sort of aggressive, physically domineering, and your worth is judged by your material gain. The fact I don't like it doesn't change the fact that that is by and large how masculinity works all over the world. And to a degree, I will also present those traits whether I'm aware of it or not, more so than any given woman would, perhaps. I think the happy medium is somewhere in between your extremes of maledom and femaledom. It's just that, again, what I think is the ideal person is not going to map onto whatever links there happen to be between biology and psychology.
Yeah, I have a couple of things there to reply with. The first is a news, a sort of a nib, news in brief that I uncovered from, where is it, 1980? No, some point in the early 20th century. Winston Churchill, this is long before he was Prime Minister. I think it was the Times. Mr. Churchill assaulted, hit with a dog whip. This is the headline. London, 14th of November. As Mr. Winston Churchill alighted from a train at the Bristol station, an alleged suffragette named Garnet, shouting, "Take that, you brute," brought down a dog whip down on the minister's head with considerable force. Garnet was arrested. And that's all I could find on Google of the event, but I remember reading it in Andrew Roberts's biography of Churchill as well. I think Garnet was a man in this case, a male suffragette, the original male feminist.
Oh God.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that Churchill, being Churchill, replied with something. I think he somehow had his own dog whip on his personage and procured it and whipped back and apprehended him and shouted something to the effect of "Take this, you blackguard," and whipped him back.
I would be surprised. I mean,
Apologies for any-
the suffragettes are a good example of not overextending a generality. The suffragettes were atypical of women of their day. We commonly now, well, at least we're often told now that it's the suffragettes that won women the vote. The same sort of historical revisionism that tells you that actually Malcolm X's Black Panthers were probably more important than Martin Luther King and his peace movement, both of which are untrue, as so much historical revisionism is. But the suffragettes were atypical. They were always a relatively small number of women who did demonstrate more masculine traits, as many women do. So it's wrong to say that, well, because this is something generally true of women, there aren't significant outliers. Of course there are. I just find the suffragettes most interesting for the way that we're constantly told that it was the suffragettes who won the vote for women, when all available evidence suggests that whenever the suffragettes did anything, they put bombs in ministers' houses, they attempted to kill people. It's just that women aren't very good at making bombs, so they failed. Whenever they tried to do this, support for women's suffrage declined. They actually set back the cause of women's suffrage, in much the same way as whenever Malcolm X's Black Panthers went and did anything exceptionally violent, you tended to find support for the sort of the white majority in the South would grow increasingly. And going even further back, whenever the communists tried anything particularly militant in Nazi Germany, the Nazi poll ratings increased. So there's a few different things to unpack there, but the one that's most pertinent to the previous discussion is, the suffragettes are a proof that you can't overgeneralize from group psychology. There are significant differences. It's just that they're not always very good.
Going back to what you were saying earlier about the percentage of FTM, female to male transgender and male to female transgender, because obviously, we hear most often about male to female. That is the overwhelming narrative that we get in the media. But according to a study by the National Institute of Health or something like that, and people can Google it. There's now as of 2020, there's an equal number of FTM and MTF, which I only bring up because I find it curious. We're talking about women's pro-sociality and the fact that very many of these social contagions, whether it's prohibitionism or transgenderism, are carried by women. To me, that would seem to suggest that you would expect to see more FTM, female to male transgenders, than you would male to female transgenders, at least in the early days. But actually, what we see is the complete opposite. We see what you're saying. I don't want to put words in your mouth. We see what you're saying is a largely female or feminine social contagion being taken up mostly by men.
No, I mean, so the to judge the difference, you have to look at the rate of increase as opposed to simply the brute numbers. So, if, for example, if, as I believe was the case, you began with more male to female transitions before transgenderism became popularized, then what you would expect to see is a higher number of them sort of latently now. What's more interesting is to note the way in which referrals have changed in their demography. So it used to be the case that transition was more a male than a female thing. Then it became a social phenomenon, and all of a sudden, the rates at which women look to transition have increased significantly as well. Rates overall have increased, but I think rates have increased more particularly for women than they have for men. I think that's true. It's certainly in the ballpark that so that produces, because of a higher starting point for men, higher starting point for MTF, but a higher rate of increase for FTM. God, I hate acronyms. That would produce a roughly equivalent number today. But the rate of increase is interesting over if you look at the last sort of 5 to 10 years, because that's what suggests there's been a change in social attitude, which has produced more interest as opposed to simply a latent catching up.
Okay. I do want to make clear as well, and I should have said this earlier, that with the whole trans thing, I mean, I don't give a rat's ass if any of my... I probably shouldn't insult my viewers in a live stream. I'm not insulting my viewers, but I don't give a rat's ass if anyone disagrees with me on this. It's I like the disagreement. I'm not just in principle opposed to transgenderism as a phenomenon. I do think that there is good reason to suppose that a tiny, certainly much smaller than we're led to believe, and that's the point. A tiny percentage of the population do, for whatever reason, feel that they need to belong to the opposite sex, and it's really why they do so, why they feel that way. I don't know, but I'm in support of accommodating that. I think one of my favorite writers, certainly one of my favorite travel writers, is Jan Morris, who of course started life as a man, James Morris, and became a woman. But what we're talking about is a social contagion. Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire talks frequently about, because that's kind of a shtick, isn't it? We each host of the Daily Wire, and I don't know who your favorite host of the Daily Wire is.
I don't really watch them. I don't have a favorite.
Well, okay. Well, each one has a sort of specialty. I think Ben Shapiro's is gun rights, and Andrew Klavan's is Christianity, and Knowles, what's his first name? Matthew.
Michael.
No,
Michael Knowles.
Michael, thank you. Yeah, I don't know what his specialty is, but obviously Matt Walsh.
Being insufferably smug, I think it is.
Yeah, I know you don't like him very much. And then obviously Matt Walsh specializes in the trans thing, but he's talked about the just incredible exponential increase in the number of young Americans who believe themselves to belong to the opposite sex, and there's clearly a social contagion thing going on, very well explored in his documentary "What Is a Woman." But I just wanted to make that caveat.
But I mean that itself is an interesting part, because we have this particularly toxic combination of things, and it's particularly true in America. It's increasingly true in this country as well, where you have an entire industry which is basically structured around grievance. There is a hierarchy of grievance, and you're told, and in fact you're induced to claim grievance because you will get preferable results in academic applications or job applications. You will be protected against sort of being made redundant because you can claim that you are part of a discriminated against minority. There's a huge number of significant incentives, financial incentives, and also social incentives to claim that you are part of a marginalized group. And the only group that it's not fashionable to belong to, because no rights accrue from being part of it, is to be white and working class and male. At the same time, we're relaxing the standards of what it means to be part of several of these minority groups. One of the reasons that the LGBTQI2SS acronym keeps expanding is that effectively it's very profitable to be part of the marginalized group, but it was previously too difficult to claim you were part of that. However, now you don't have to show any receipts for this. You can simply say you're queer. And that's one of the reasons that I think the most recent statistic found up to 25% of Gen Z claimed to be part of the LGBTAIQ2SS Rainbow Reich community. They've effectively abandoned all standards for entry, but they've not abandoned the rights and the privileges that accrue from entry. Which is why it's peculiar to note the way in which even the trans movement doesn't require actual proof of receipts. The big push towards self-ID is essentially to make it easier to claim that you are something that you are not, because you've not taken the trouble to become it. That's not particularly healthy. It's not particularly helpful either, because if you did away with the massive expansion of definitions, you would probably find a fairly constant number or share of the population exhibits gay traits, lesbian traits, bisexual traits, and gender dysmorphia, body dysmorphia even. These things don't tend to change over time because they do have fairly naturalistic causes. But people are allowed to claim it much more easily now, and so, of course, the rates of people claiming it increase without ever having to do it. There have been studies showing that, even though 25% of Americans under the age of, 20, say that they're part of the LGBTAIQ plus Z2QQZZSS community, the vast majority of them have only ever had sexual relations with the opposite sex. In other words, they're straight, but they think it's fashionable to claim not to be, which is a bit pathetic, and I think these people should be told to stop, and they shouldn't be induced to do it. But nevertheless, that's the state of affairs in which we find ourselves. The trans thing is particularly difficult as well, because when you have no standards like that, some people, there's always the temptation to maximalize. So once it becomes commonly accepted that the fashionable thing is simply to claim your adherence to this part of the community, the maximalizing tendency will say, well, you have to go one further. And that, I think, is where some of the social contagion behind the explosion of trans interest occurs, is people who want to go one step further to be even cooler than their friends, because that's basically how children work. Children are idiots. That's a dangerous one, because you're also relaxing standards required to get people to physically transition to begin with, which isn't particularly good. And also because no long-term studies exist proving the efficacy of any of the medicines. Those that do exist, the short and medium-term studies, are not particularly clear, and some of the short-term ones suggest it's quite negative. One of the only actual long-term studies around the subject that exists says that it's something like 76% of M to F transitioners, if left alone, just become gay boys. And the danger of telling them that it's fashionable to go further because you can't possibly admit to being gay, you have to be more than that, is that you are forcing people who should never transition down a much easier path to transition, as opposed to simply coming out of the closet, which it's never been easier to do.
And suicidality, I might add, has been shown to be highest, I think, around 7 years after transition.
7 to 9, I think, is the figure for
which
that.
is a really tragic. I mean, part of the reason I added the caveat before is this is a deeply tragic situation that we find ourselves in. I mean, it's easy for, my next video, for those who are interested, is partly on the culture war and how it's the product of demons, but that's another, you'll have to wait and see. But it's easy for people on the left or the right to sort of wade in on the culture war, and such and such destroys such and such, and it's all very trashy. And I wanted to make the caveat on the trans issue, partly to point out the sensitivity of it all. I mean, the tragedy in part, the fact that you can go through medically, corporate sanctioned, state sanctioned transitions, and your suicidality will be highest long after the transition. I mean, that in itself is an extremely tragic situation to find oneself in. But
it's because most people who present to gender transition clinics have an abnormally high rate of comorbidities. In other words, they are depressed, but they are depressed for a huge number of different reasons. They also have other psychological conditions which can, in fact, manifest in the desire to transition, but not actually be reduced to the desire to transition. In other words, the desire to transition can simply be the result of your comorbidities, which are masking the true cause of your discontent. Now, again, it's important to stress that the figure I gave earlier, like 75-76% of people will just grow up to be gay, still leaves about a quarter of those who present as not being gay. There is something more going on there. So there isn't this either or proposition purely. It's not that there can only be trans people or no trans people. It's that actually, no, the odds are that there's going to be a very small proportion of people who are, so to speak, genuinely trans, and the majority are not. But they are still people who are genuinely trans and should not be overlooked, certainly shouldn't be stigmatized against, and should be, afforded to the greatest extent possible the right to live as full a life as anybody else. The unique difficulty comes, and the problem when you combine these different letters to the acronym, is that some of these are mutually exclusionary. So it's very hard when you're saying that we must transition people, 75% of whom would otherwise be gay, to deny the narrative that what you're really doing is kind of what Iran does. Iran has one of the best gender reassignment surgeries and rates of successful surgery in the world, because they believe that it's better to grow up as the opposite sex than it is to grow up gay. And when you are making it very easy for people to transition as opposed to simply reveal that about themselves, what you're really doing is you're at least rubbing up against one of the other letters in the acronym in a non-consensual way. And that's without even touching on the question of women's rights and the intersection with feminism, which is where most of the dialogue comes from these days, and most of the argument comes from, which I imagine is incredibly depressing as a genuine trans person who isn't likely to want to compete against women in cycling or football or rugby or boxing or MMA, who just wants to live a normal, quiet life. It must be very distressing to hear yourself reduced to prison statistics and rape statistics, and reminded all the time that certain traits and behaviors are biologically ingrained. And if we didn't have so many cases of effectively pathological narcissists who are transitioning mostly for their own reputational reasons and then to jump up several dozen places in sports leagues, then you wouldn't have this issue. But we do have the issue because we've made the standards far too loose and too easy. I'm familiar with the argument, from some genuine trans people that it's very difficult to transition anyway, certainly in some countries more than others. That there is, trans people have an incentive to want to transition earlier because it's then easier to pass for the opposite sex later in life. It's more difficult the longer you wait. However, we do live in as someone in chat says, we live in a society, and societies require trade-offs. And I think, if you're given a choice between slightly harder transition, which takes slightly longer, but much less social approbation and condemnation, versus all the condemnation and no better treatment, I think the answer would be live the quiet life, accept the trade-off, and disavow and disown those people who claim that they're trans in order to beat women at cycling.
Well, of course, one of the supreme ironies of the trans movement, the trans ideology, is that the very people, the kind of people who are in favor of it, like to think that they're bucking all of the traditional trends, traditional gender roles, and all the rest of it. They see themselves as very much on the forefront of everything that's radical in society. But actually, looking at a young boy who likes pink or Barbies or whatever, and claiming that he's actually a girl, or looking at a young girl who likes monster trucks or whatever it is, or fighting, is actually a boy. These people are evincing, without very much self-knowledge, the most entrenched, stereotypical nuclear family, 1950s American nuclear family, Americana, gender roles that you can possibly imagine. So that they're actually much more reactionary than they themselves think they are. And I do just want to touch on that point quickly, which is that very many social conservative, and I count myself as a social conservative. I have to be clear about that. Obviously, it depends what you mean by that, but I'm happy to identify as such. They look to 1950s Americana and the nuclear family and all the rest of it. And by nuclear family, I don't just mean family. I'm all in favor of families. But the nuclear family is something very, very particular. It's the woman more or less chained to the sink, but she's happy, and the man going off with his briefcase in the morning to work and come back. And so effectively the woman is economically unproductive, except insofar as she is able to allow the man to be economically productive, and in that much the family unit as a whole is economically productive. If that
It
makes
goes a
any
little bit
sense.
further. I mean, it's even
So
more
problem-
economically productive. So
well,
men who are married outperform men who are not married. They outperform women who are not married, and women who are married but not in the workplace effectively contribute to a wage premium for the husband. He spends more time at work, he can earn more, he's more contented, he's happier, he's higher achieving. And so households with a married couple quite often outperform economically households in which both partners work.
Well, I know that's the case. Yeah, so that's what I was trying to drive at, although rather less eloquently than you. But the reason that the 1950s Americana nuclear family is not the sort of model we should be only looking at as social conservatives is that it's very much a post-industrial revolution phenomenon. Before the Industrial Revolution, one of the largest subterranean, if you will, economies in Britain was run by women. Before the Industrial Revolution, if you wanted anything made, whether that be a carpet or a dress or some curtains or anything like that. If you wanted anything made, you had to defer to this vast nationwide interlinked cottage industry of women in the home knitting and sewing and weaving and the like. So they were economically productive. They literally, tangibly, quantitatively contributed to the national economy at a local level. And after the Industrial Revolution, or during the Industrial Revolution, uh, what that does is it takes all of these economically productive women at the cottage industry level, and it farms them off into these vast machine-like, matrix-like factory farms, not factory farms. Well, the comparison is apt. Um, into these huge factories, and they will die of malnutrition, whereas previously they might not have. And they will be divorced from their family because there was sexual, there was gender. What's the word? When you're separated, but from according to race or gender, or whatever it is. You're
Segregated.
Yes, thank you. You're segregated from your families. Your kids die of malnutrition, sweeping chimneys. They're getting caught in machinery. As the Dickens was brought up in this milieu. So the Industrial Revolution is indeed revolutionary because it takes this cottage industry out. It rips it from the heart of the social fabric of Britain. And I can't speak to America, but that's what it does in Britain. So there's a whole question of gender roles there. The social conservatives who are pushing back against much of what they don't like in the woke movement, one of the things they'll do is they'll defer to this sort of the 1950s vision of the family. And I'm not saying there was anything wrong with that. I'm not saying that a woman or a wife cannot be happy in that role. We see this now on social media with this whole trad wife phenomenon. And that's obviously getting a lot of pushback for often quite stupid reasons. If women freely choose, because obviously, feminists constantly talk about that women should be free to choose X, Y, and Z. They don't like when women choose, actually, I'd like to, cook for my husband when he comes home and raise my children and be a housewife. But it is worth pointing out, actually, that a lot of this is very much more socially contingent than either the left or the right are willing to admit. That women have in the past been very much more economically productive in an immediate sense than they have done in, say, the 1950s or 60s. So that's one point. And the second point, and this I don't want to overload you, but this is something I've been meaning to say. There's a distinction to be made between culture and civilization. You were talking earlier about how a lot of men, so Andrew Tate kind of men, and the people who follow him, they think that the synonym of man and manhood is muscle, basically, to put it in its simplest form. To be a man, you just gotta, take what you want, treat women however you want, have lots of muscle, and be a narcissistic prick in the process. That's culture. Civilization, the whole point of civilization is that it is supposed to soften and heighten and edify those base instincts. So yes, there is something in the notion that men are more muscular than women. They're more physically capable. You mentioned men in women's sports, transgender women in women's sports. They consistently outperform women in pretty much every sport except long distance running. But that's not what manhood is supposed to be about, because that civilization is about edifying these base cultural distinctions that we make. It's often said that Vikings didn't have a civilization; they had a culture. Well, we had a civilization to some extent. We still do. And the point there is, what do you want, muscle or fatherhood? Because many of the best fathers I know, including my own, have pot bellies, not six packs.
Well, which was always traditionally a sign of affluence, and a success within civilization means much readier access to food and wine, in your father's case. Marco Genovese asked a little bit earlier where the statistic I mentioned about women and men earning more when they're married than some people do individually. There's a brilliant book called Women's Figures, and I'm trying to remember who wrote it. It's escaped me at the moment. I think it's Diana something. There's a really long, complicated, double-barreled German name, which is going to be my excuse for not remembering the author. But the book is two authors. The book is Women's Figures. I suggest you look it up. It's well worth reading. This spells a lot of stuff, including around pay gaps and wage gaps and all the rest of that nonsense. No, you're right about that. It's the problem at the moment is that we have competing definitions and ideas about what civilization really entails, and they've become mutually excluding. You have the trad wife reactionary movement, which essentially says in order for men to flourish, women must be reduced, so to speak, back to a position with minimal agency by compared to today. But then you have the other movement, which is it's cheap to call it feminist, given that feminists are fundamentally opposed to each other on many of these questions. But let's broadly speaking call it feminist vision, which is that men are responsible for all of society's ills. That the much re-rendered quote about society being better off and less conflict driven if more women were in power, which is blatantly untrue. History proves this, but nevertheless, it recurs for that reason. In other words, it's either women to blame for the collapse of civilization or men, and we don't seem to have lit upon or remembered a definition of society in which both can flourish with their competing but equally valued and valuable ways in their equivalently valuable ways. Again, everything, the tendency is to maximalization now, which is kind of depressing, I think. But I mean, the other aspect of that, of course, and going back to what you were saying about women being taken out of the home and put into the conventional workplace, is that these things have costs as well as profits to them. So one of the reasons, even Wikipedia, which is pretty lefty at this point, even Wikipedia would acknowledge, if you go and look up the article about the effects of women in the workplace, will acknowledge that employers liked it when women came into the workplace because it suppressed wages. Because that's what happens if you suddenly double the size of the workforce without increasing productivity. The influx of women into the workplace had a downward impact on wages just by the basic laws of economics. If you have a competing number of businesses for a small number of workers who are all male, because that's only half the population, you can afford to pay people, you have to pay people more to compete for a limited workforce than if you can pick from the whole population. But there are other costs to it as well. And it's not just that these fall on women, it's just that for various psychological reasons they tend to fall on women, that there's a movement in the United States and the United Kingdom at the moment which is to expand the amount of free childcare available to people, because it's so costly and expensive, don't you know, to look after a child. Well, it's like, well, yes, but also you could be doing that yourself, and you wouldn't have to pay for nanny, and you wouldn't have to pay for the creche, and you would actually spend more time with your kid. And in the long run, for you, it would be cheaper, and you wouldn't be having to fork out for ludicrously expensive state-sanctioned, state-provided childcare services if you stayed home and did it for yourself. That's a way of saving some money. And actually, a lot of the time when we talk about women's habits in the workplace, we do tend to assume that the typical form is the go-get-em, careerist, single-minded, I'm as good as the man, I don't need no man type of woman. But actually, women are vastly disproportionately likely to stay at home at least part-time to look after kids and work a part-time job. The people who set the agenda in the news media, the people who write columns and the people who form opinion on this matter, will tell you that that's only because they can't afford to go out to work more, as opposed to because they can afford not to go out to work more, because they're actually saving money by taking care of their child who they want to see more of. It doesn't have to be women who do this. Men can do it too. If the woman wants to go out to work full-time, have a part-time male worker as your spouse, it just doesn't naturally occur that way. And again, sometimes you will hear the response, which is that, well, that's of course social conditioning. All of this is a social construct. We need to get away from the patriarchal idea that the man has to be the breadwinner. But whenever anybody comes up with a sociological explanation like that, I have to say, find me a country in the world where that is not so. Because if it happens everywhere, throughout history, in every culture, in every time period, whether they're connected to each other or as distant from each other as like imperial China and feudal Japan to capitalist America, then maybe there's something more behind it than mere socializing of boys. Unless you're saying that there's some one united global culture that somehow impacts North Korea just as readily as it impacts Sweden.
Well, yeah, in speaking of Sweden, I was going to say that the Nordic countries are the perfect example of what you're saying. No other set of countries have invested more time and money in equalizing men and women in terms of the roles and the jobs that they have in society. And it's been shown that as soon as that parity is is reached at any level, they start diverging immediately based on their own choices. And just sort of a corollary to that is I distinguish in my own thinking on this subject between accidental and essential differences between men and women. So feminists, or not just feminists, but people in general, they often will say, and I think it's a rather outdated thing to say. I don't think this pertains as much as people tend to think it does anymore. But boys will be bought blue toys, for instance, in the supermarkets, and girls will be bought pink toys. And that boys are taught to like blue and hate pink, and girls are taught to love pink and hate blue. Again, I don't think this is very true anymore. I think it's an extremely outdated thing to say. But that's an accidental thing. I mean, I think it was in the Victorian era, pink was actually considered a masculine color. So something like that is completely contingent. But in terms of the gender roles that men and women tend to take on average, and again, the Nordic countries are a good example of this, it is the case that men tend to want to assume provider roles. They tend to want to go into STEM subjects. They tend to want to do the dangerous jobs, partly because they're better fitted to do so. Even in the most woke countries, in other words, Britain, Canada, and America and New Zealand, and I think to a lesser extent Australia, but we'll see. Even in the military, so far as I understand, there are still some forms of legal constraints that prohibit women from being on the front lines in the military. I don't know whether that's still the case or not, but it just goes
Yeah.
to show that there is, everyone knows it. I mean, it's ridiculous that you even have to state this, but everyone knows that there are differences between men and women that dictate what they do, and everyone knows at a deep level, although some people are completely in denial about this, obviously, that men and women are different, and that they are therefore better or worse, depending on which gender you are, which sex you are, at certain things and certain jobs and certain occupations.
They do. There was one of the branches of the armed forces in America in the last few years. Americans in the chat will probably know more about this than I do, but I vaguely remember hearing that there was one of the divisions of the armed forces, it might even have been the special forces, which was opened up to women on the proviso that the physical aptitude test would not be changed, because, of course, that is the key qualifier for anyone who's going into frontline combat. You have to be able to actually, do the job. And inevitably, when it turned out that 98% of women who applied, and there weren't very many of them anyway, but when 98% of them failed to meet the physical requirements, you know exactly what happens after that. People who have never fought on the front lines, people who've never done any physical training because they're Congress people, immediately start saying, well, this is evidence that there's some sort of institutional sexism that is preventing women from succeeding, even though we've opened up this division of the armed forces to them. So that must be changed. In which case you get, well, what is the only answer to that? We have to decrease standards for physical aptitude. So don't be surprised when you go to war with China in the next 80 years to find that your newly slightly feminized soldiers are not going to perform as well because the standards of entry have been lowered. There was always the argument when arguments about the draft were being had back in this episode's a firing line about this, about whether or not women's equality should also entail equality under the law as far as the draft is concerned. And answers to that ranged from, well, the draft shouldn't exist anyway, and I can get on board with that suggestion, but I think in times of war there are exceptions. Or, well, no, we want equality, but of course not that. I was like, well, okay, but then it's not equality, is it? You're recognizing either you have some deep-seated psychological aversion to the idea of being drafted yourself, in which case, why don't the men have the same recourse? Or you're recognizing that maybe women won't be very good in that role, or that they have other more valuable roles to do. I think women tend to do much better in intelligence roles, for example. Certain areas of intelligence in particular. There are certain areas which disproportionately suit highly autistic people, and they tend to be men. But there are other areas of intelligence which rely on social intelligence, which women outperform men at all the damn time. Some of the code breakers, some of the best code breakers in World War II on our side were women, I believe. Very seldom recognized for their work. Some of the earliest NASA engineers responsible for coding and typing and inputting data were women as well. Again, very often they were not given credit for the work that they did. and so it's overcorrection that there are a number of roles women can do and do brilliantly that they have indeed been kept away from, and that's bad, and we should do away with that. But by and large, we already have. But there's a difference between doing that and saying that, well, women are just as capable of all roles as men are, or men are just as capable of all roles as women are, and therefore standards should be lowered until we get equity. Because that's just lowering the common denominator. That's not actually raising women or men up in their respective fields. And again, we're talking disproportionately here in terms of what women can't do. I don't want to give the impression that we're just shitting on women, because there are plenty of jobs and roles in which men simply do not do as well. And that demonstrates itself very early on, actually, going through school, for example. You compare the rates of success in terms of examination to schools which focus on exams, at which boys do incredibly well, and schools which focus on coursework, at which girls do incredibly well. And one of the understated reasons for the huge inversion of educational trends at the moment, which has now seen the least performing demographic being white working class boys, has had a lot to do with the fact that schools have disproportionately moved to coursework over examinations, which is kind of related to the fact that schools' teaching departments are now demographically almost 90% women, who, of course, flourish doing coursework themselves. It's, again, an attempt at overcorrection. Boys do incredibly well at exams because they're more immediate. They don't plan things very well. They're not very good long-term thinkers, and girls are at that age. Girls mature much more quickly. Girls think much more logically at that age, and arguably at later ages as well. So there are a number of roles that women can do that men don't do as well. It's just that we don't tend to fight about those because men don't really care. Whereas there's a subset of women which very much cares that they're not seen as equally able at things that men can do, which I think is just devaluing of your own unique skills, personally.
Yes, I tended to cram everything before exams. I did very little revision, right from GCSE to A-level to university, and I know that was the case with you. Don't lie.
My undergrad dissertation, it was 9,000 words. I didn't even have a question to write to until the day before, and I wrote it on the deadline day. 9,000 words of it, and then that got a first. But I can't plan. If you asked me to do that over multiple days, I flunked geography at school because they did it coursework, and I didn't have the patience for coursework, didn't care. Unless it was something really specific and niche, like we did a history coursework on castles and medieval battle tactics. I was brilliant at that one because I play lots of Total War.
Yeah, I've been meaning to play Total War actually. Well, is that the game? The Civilization? That's the one that
That's
you
also
play.
pretty good, yeah.
Yeah. No, I downloaded that on the old Switch. Is that what it's called? Switch?
Yes. Not a gamer, are you?
No. Well, I'm apparently I'm apparently a normie. Is that what it's called? A normie?
Yes. Yeah, you are very much. If you have to say, is that what it's called after you say normie, then yes, you are very much a normie.
Yeah, it's strange. I'm technically a millennial, and I have a YouTube channel, and I'm now monetized. Super chats, guys, super chats. But so I know what that means because it benefits me, but I don't know what anything else means. I have to ask now. I have to ask people. The meme. Is it a meme? I have to confirm that it's a meme before I say. Anyway, the meme X, and then describe the meme. It's ridiculous. I recently did a video on midwits because I encountered someone I thought was a midwit at a pub, and someone commented. Someone. Generally, the comments are pretty good on my videos, for which I'm very grateful because I know what the internet can be like. But someone commented the fact that you used a Wojak meme in your thumbnail, it makes you despicable. And I had to Google what Wojak meant. I had no idea.
Yeah, well, that person was probably full of soy, so I wouldn't worry too much about that.
What's soy?
Oh my god. Okay, we've proven the point. We can move on.
we've proven the point, have we? Billy the Kid has commented, "Men are more logical," which I think.
True.
I'm hoping that was purposeful, because it would sort of be ironic. But oh yeah,
girls learn to spell many years before boys do as well. So that's another thing at which the women are pretty good. I'm not shitting on the women all the time.
No, he's corrected himself. That's the good thing. Oh dear. No, men and women. I mean, we could go on for hours about the relations between men and women at the moment. If anyone's interested and they haven't seen it already, my video "Fuckboys, Thoughts and Feminists" goes into the relationship between men and women in the context of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, in the sense that, Romeo is expected by Juliet to express his devotion by negating his sexual desire and marrying her, and he's not allowed to have sex with her before he marries her, and only once he's married is he allowed to express his full love. But of course they don't get the opportunity because they both die. But it's worth a watch. I hope you'll agree.
Yeah, no, I do. But I'll go back to Peter Pan as another good example, just because I've been watching them all recently. There's a really
I haven't read it, by the way. I did.
well,
My dad told me once, because he had a friend called Wendy growing up, that the name Wendy was invented by J.M. Barrie for the purposes of that novel, and I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, go on.
I don't know if that's no. I'm not sure if it's true. I imagine it was popularized by it, certainly. Well, the novel's really interesting. The novel is much darker and much more morally ambiguous, and it portrays the pitfalls of Peter's eternal youth much more starkly than any of the subsequent films have done. In the novel, there's a sort of an epilogue that doesn't even very often get used in the plays. When Peter goes back years later, and of course he's still a young boy, to pick Wendy up again to take her back to Neverland, and to him it's like he's been away for a day, but it turns out he's just forgotten her for several years, and so by the time he goes back, she's an older woman, she's married, she's got kids of her own, and she's sort of slightly still heartbroken that he forgot her because he's a young boy, and young boys don't give a shit about things like this. And so in the end, it's also revealed in that epilogue that you think of all of the classic tropes of their adventure, the battles with Captain Hook, Tinkerbell, and how adoring she is of him. And he's forgotten all of them as well, because again, he's a young boy. He doesn't really give a shit. And so it's a tragic ending to the story, in the sense that, okay, yeah, we all might hanker after eternal youth, but there are consequences, and those consequences are that you don't form actual attachments, you don't learn to love, you don't form memories. You will never gain the full lived experience of growing up. You will just have simple, carefree, in-the-moment fun, which forms nothing in your mind at all. There's no stakes, there's no consequences, nothing worth remembering. And that's a sad realization. And he takes her, Wendy's daughter, off back to Neverland. And it's mentioned that, years later he took her granddaughter off to Neverland, but all the time he will forget about them. He'll forget about everything they did because he just doesn't give a shit. But on the women and men point, I mean, this is sort of tied into it, because people often think that Peter Pan is a story simply about eternal youth. It's not. It's about eternal boyhood, very specifically eternal boyhood. The whole dramatic contrast between Wendy and Peter is that she's on the cusp of adulthood. She's not that much older in terms of numbers than Peter is, but girls mature much more quickly. In Barry's version, he actually has a line explaining that the reason there are no lost girls is that girls are too clever to fall out of their perambulators, which is the reason that boys end up in Neverland. They're silly, they fall out of their prams, and they get whisked away because they're fundamentally unserious, frivolous little shits. There's an essential difference between boys and girls that underpins the entire thing. And it plays up the women's perspective all throughout. And this new adaptation, which is ostensibly trying to put Wendy further to the fore, has completely missed the point that she was always the moral author of that story. She was always the one who grew up to give moral lessons. She is the example by which to lead. She's the one who gives educational value. She's the one who grows up. She's the one who we actually are supposed to embody, as opposed to idolize. And she has to overcome her sort of naivety and her desire for eternal youth by overcoming Peter and what he represents, which she does in part because she realizes as a boy he's basically an idiot at this age, and so all of her romantic aspirations which she has for him are fruitless. And there's a number of other characters. Tinkerbell is romantically attached to Peter, and he banishes her without a moment's thought because she's jealous of Wendy and tries to get her killed. There's Tiger Lily, the Indian princess, who also has this sort of forlorn love with Peter. She's saving herself for him, but he'll never grow up, so he'll never repay that. So this essential difference between boys and girls is integral to the story, but it also, not only does it portray girls as being more mature and more sensible, it also, in the original and in the Disney version, it really does extol the virtues of what women can grow up to be. So Wendy has a speech in the original when she's tired of Peter. He's embarrassed her and he's let her down, and so she says to her young brothers, "No, we're going home tomorrow." And they say, no, we're staying. And she says, no, you need parents, you need a mother. And they say, well, you can be our mother. And she says, well, I can't be a mother. And then all the Lost Boys realize that they kind of remember having a mother, but they don't remember what one is. And so she gives a long sort of soliloquy about what a mother is. A mother is the most bright, the most brilliant person. She's the person who sings you to bed at night. She's the person who gives you lullabies. She's the person who kisses your cheek and rubs the dirt off your knees and all the rest of that. And it's really lovely. And she sings a little song about the virtues of motherhood. Compare it to 2023, when reducing women to motherhood is reducing women. And the entire line is reduced to, I'm not your mother, I don't even know if I want to be a mother. And that's it. And then you think that you have no conception of what the story's about, do you? You think that for a woman to be the front and center of the story, she has to wield the sword and beat the bad guy and punch people in the face and be unspeakably generic and unmemorable, and you have no conception of what the moral point of the story you're telling is, or why there are different ways of ennobling men and women, and that the women come out far better from Peter Pan than the boys do. But no, we have to reduce them to the same thing. And I have a video going out about this tomorrow. So for more of that rant, 7-ish p.m., 8 p.m, can't remember. At some point tomorrow, a full Peter Pan review will drop.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, there's so much in that. I've read, as I say, I've never read the book, but I've read before about how actually the vision of Peter Pan and this eternal sort of Neverland of adolescence is quite a horrifying prospect, all things considered.
Sorry, vaping. Yes, yeah, no, well, it is.
Oh, sorry, yeah, no, yeah, no, indeed. Well, that might be a good place to wrap it up, because I have work tomorrow on boats, where I get to live out my own personal Neverland of pretending that I'm a pirate, like in my avatar. So yeah, tune in, anyone who's listening to the Little Platoon's video tomorrow night. What time did you say it was?
I think I'm an open bar at 9, so it'll have to be, I'd guess 7:30.
7:30. Excellent. And my next video, what have I called it? The Diabolic West and the Culture War will be out hopefully on Friday. So tune into that if you want to. Do you have any other announcements to make?
Hail Satan, I don't know.
It's strangely apt considering what my video will be about.
I know, that's why I chose it. Yes.
But for those who are not aware, there's a few comments earlier in the video about Christianity. I am a Christian, and the Little Platoon is most assuredly not, which is wonderful, because that's why we're such good friends. We're able to have these. We're able to entertain these radical differences.
Just a note, because I know you're new to the streaming thing. So etiquette is that if you have super chats, we cover super chats, and we haven't done that yet.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry.
So I reckon let's round off. Let's do another half an hour if you've got time. It would be nice to address the super chats.
Yes. How do we do that?
You starred them yourself. Hit the star thing. You know where it says live and starred?
Star, yes.
Starred.
I've starred quite a few people.
Good.
Okay, so
anything there you want to respond to, do, and we can field questions or comments or whatever they have.
Well, in that case, I owe my listeners an apology, particularly my super chat people an apology, and you a thanks, because I'm new to this, as you say. So yeah, I've starred a few people, many of whom on. Okay, well, I do want to thank Mark Andrew Edwards in particular. He is, I believe, a patron on my Patreon thing. He's a regular reader of my Substack, which you should all head to if you're not a reader already. Most of my content is free and will be for some time. Yeah, read that if you will. Mark Andrew Edwards is a loyal reader and listener and viewer and so on. So thank you, Mark Andrew Edwards, for your loyalty.
I like this bit, because I get to conduct a stream while the stream is happening. So when you hover over the comment,
yeah,
you can hit the show button and it will appear on your screen. There you go.
Thank you, Mark Andrew Edwards. Oh god, this is embarrassing. I told you I was a normie. So yeah, thank you. Scooter Tart, I have to say, Scooter Tart, your comments this evening have been my personal favorites. I don't know who the hell you are. I've never seen you before, unless I'm not very observant. But thank you thank you for showing up and for having such good comments, such as this one. He's such a bellend. I think you're referring to Andrew Tate. Harball99, you've been another favorite of mine this evening with your erudition and wisdom. Thank you. First super chat, Party Almzivi. Why do I think he's Jewish? Does that sound like a Jewish name to you?
I thought Eastern European, but
Eastern Europe. Well, you can be.
to be fair, the question "Why do I think he's Jewish?" could be taken in a number of different ways, and I think you should probably emphasize that you are right wing, you are not a Nazi.
For the avoidance of doubt, I'm a massive Philo-Semite. I wish I were Jewish sometimes. If it were not for the fact I were Christian, I would be Jewish. But yeah, thank you for your $1.99. Thanks to inflation, I will get about 1 pence in the.
And the comment is, so what I'm hearing is suffrage was a mistake. No, it's just that everything has trade-offs, including suffrage.
Exactly. Thanks go to Magnus Horace, to Franco Walker, to Tom Abella, again Franco Walker, Billy the Kid. I'm pretty sure you were a criminal in real life, so well chosen username there. Angel Messenger.
Okay. You're supposed to read the comments, dude.
I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm doing.
Okay.
Angel Messenger, who we surmised was the only woman listening, very kindly gifted.
I think I spotted a second one. I think there were two at one point. YouTube is a 90% male platform, though, so it's a curious one.
Well, there we go. I thought that the fact that my audience was mostly male was some sort of aberration. But if you're saying that's common to YouTube,
No. Yes, it's general. Women don't tend to frequent the platform. It is also why women do tend to do better on YouTube. Like the fewer YouTubers who are women, basically, if you have tits, you're onto something good because people will watch those things for hours.
well, this was your criticism of Game of Thrones from the very beginning, wasn't it? That it was just
Well, the sex position stuff was very deliberately there to entice people in a way because they weren't sure in season 1 that they could rely on people to pay attention to the complex narrative. So a liberal dashing of tits was one of the means in which they tried to keep people's attention. They did stop doing that after a time, though, to my pleasure, but I gather not to everyone's.
You're not a big fan of tits.
I could take them or leave them.
Oh dear. So I've done a bad thing and not starred some of the actual super chats.
It's fine. You're learning. The next time, just whenever someone does that, it's a courtesy thing. You star it, you read it, you thank them, and sometimes they spark interesting conversations.
Oh well, okay. Marilla Cuthbert 20 has very kindly gifted $20, and it's a nice Converse there in their profile pic. I think that's Converse. So thank you, Marilla Cuthbert 20. This is the weird. This is what I'm getting used to on YouTube and Substack and the general internet scene. People I've never met giving me money for talking, albeit with interesting people. I don't think they're giving me money. I think they're giving you money.
No. It's a nice thing, but I tend to view YouTube as it's an optional thing. It's what I wish something like the BBC would be. Like you pay for something if you like it. We're happy to entertain people. Really though, it relies on chat to keep us entertained. One of the great things about super chats and reading chat and comments and keeping them on screen and things is that people will bring up things that you hadn't considered. They'll bring up interesting points of conversation. They'll bring up corrections when I'm randomly spouting off statistics I've only half remembered. Though not too often. I'm glad to see. So it makes chat. It's a much more involving thing all around. Like I love reading chat. It's the reason videos take ages to put together. This Peter Pan thing is painful, but I enjoy putting the video out. Partly because it's work that I've done, but also because I get to sit around in chat for the premiere for the next hour or however long the video is. And just talk to people. Memes are born in chat, and then they appear in subsequent videos. It's a great community thing.
Well, they certainly do in your chats. I mean, you're something of a celebrity now. Little Platoon.
No. A few 100,000 to go yet.
Anyone listening who is a massive fan of the Little Platoon and was first introduced to him through YouTube must know that I know all his faults. I knew him before he was the Little Platoon. I knew him, if you listen to the beginning of this video, I knew him when he was falling into glasses of water drunk. There's nothing he can say or do that will shock me. Um, oh, there we go. Tom Abella has very kindly gifted $5 just now, and specifically said, "This is not for the Little Platoon." And Marco Genovese has said, "Oski knows where the Little Platoon is buried, all the bodies." I do know where the Little Platoon is buried, all of his
Yeah,
bodies.
the problem is that he'll be one of them if he ever reveals it. So.
Well, all of this is a really good way of saying that I hope to have you back on the show, if not next week, then as frequently as possible, because not just because I love talking to you, but because I think that we make a good duo, and
Yeah.
the more you can appear on State of Disunion, the better.
It wouldn't be disunion if I weren't here. So yeah, it's a good idea. I'll be here as often as I can.
And a final thank you to AJB Holsters, who's donated $5, who says this was an excellent discussion. Thank you, Franco Walker. This was enjoyable indeed. Thank you, the Little Platoon, for I keep meaning I'm almost using your real name as I'm thanking you here, but of course we preserve anonymity here. I could of course call you just like Gerald or Keith or something. I know you.
People in Mr. Brownshine call me Ben all the time. It's fine, but yeah, no, I'm with AGB Holsters. I completely understand falling asleep in the theater watching the first Avatar film. I don't think I fell asleep in the first one. I had to spend 4 days with the second one, so that was torture, which I don't intend to repeat.
Do you remember when your mum forced us to watch Avatar 1?
Yes, I do. It pissed me off then, just as it pissed me off the first time.
I'm too polite. I'm terribly English, so I sat there saying the required things like, "Oh, this was brilliant." And I think I deceived myself. Even I genuinely for a short period there. Sorry, I don't mean to keep you, Ben.
No, well, the longer you start, the more Melvin will contribute in Super Chats. So there is one more we should probably get to before we hit the close button, and then we can leave.
Yeah, well, okay, I tell you what. Why don't you dictate when the close button should be clicked? Because I'm happy to talk to you all night.
Bring Melvin. Oh, I'm fine. I think I need to finish this Peter Pan thing. So let's do Melvin's, because that's a question which might take us some time to answer, and then we'll wrap up, I think.
If you had a time machine, what advice would you give to your 10-year-old self? Oh shit, that is
And if I went back to the 10-second
like
ago, me would say, click the comment and bring it up on the screen.
There we go.
There you go.
That's like Richard Dawkins being asked, as he was indeed asked by one interviewer, define happiness, and he said, "Oh God, I don't know. Get a fucking dictionary off the shelf. I don't know."
Mine would be start YouTube in 2015.
Invest in Bitcoin whenever the hell Bitcoin.
Invest in Bitcoin's a good one, yeah.
Yeah.
I know, I'm just gutted. I missed the Last Jedi stuff. I missed the Captain Marvel stuff, and I'm just happy that we now seem to be doing all of that again. So the Marvels comes out later this year. I get my chance to take a shot at Captain Marvel. Yeah, start YouTube earlier would be the 10-year-old. Oh, my 10-year-old self as opposed to 10 years ago, though that's a different one. 10-year-old self. Learn to play guitar, piano, and sing, and don't play trumpet, because that was a complete waste of my talent.
Never become a vegetarian.
Good advice, yes.
Marry your high school sweetheart as soon as possible. Become a Christian as soon as possible. These are all very evidently my answers.
The 10-year-olds are statistically less safe in the church than you are, so...
Depends which church. I'm not a member of the Roman Catholic Communion, so I wouldn't know.
No, not after what happened.
You're an atheist. We'll leave it at that. Well, this has been wonderful. Yeah, I hope to have you back next week, Ben.
I'll be back as often as possible. Yeah, I will try and have a premiere ready to queue up so we can bring some more people over. But otherwise, yeah, if I'm around next Wednesday, I shall be here.
Spiffing. Yeah. Well, to round it up then, State of Disunion, unless I am otherwise indisposed, every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. British time. Subscribe, share, all that crap. Yeah. Thank you for lending me your time.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for everyone in the chat. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.